The scream cut through the great hall before anyone could react. Elena Marsh was halfway through pouring a cup of tea when the sound tore across the room, sharp and desperate, and every head turned toward the far end of the hall, where a young man had collapsed against the stone floor. His body convulsed. Foam gathered at the corner of his mouth. The crowd around him staggered backward instead of forward, as if his suffering might spread to them like fire jumping from one dry branch to another. Elena did not think. She moved. She crossed the hall faster than her age should have allowed, her long skirt catching against her ankles, her heart hammering with a focus she had trained into herself over 20 years of practice. She dropped to her knees beside the young man, pressed 2 fingers to his throat, and felt his pulse stutter beneath her fingertips like a moth beating against glass. "Someone bring me water. Clean water. Now," she said, her voice steady even as chaos swirled around her. Nobody moved. The pack elders stood frozen, their eyes wide with a kind of helpless horror that made them useless. It was a young server girl, barely out of her teenage years, who finally broke free of the crowd and ran toward the kitchen, skirts flying behind her. Elena turned the young man onto his side so he would not choke, and pressed her palm firmly against his stomach, testing for the telltale tightness that would confirm what her instincts already suspected. Poison. Something fast-acting, something meant to work quietly in a crowd this large, this loud, this distracted. "What did he eat?" she called out, scanning the nearby tables. "Think, what did he touch that no one else touched?" A voice from the crowd finally answered, shaking. "The wine." He grabbed the last cup from the silver tray, the one meant for the guest table. Elena's stomach tightened. The guest table. The table reserved for the visiting delegation from the north, the very people the Ashwood pack had spent the past 3 days preparing to impress. If the wine had been meant for one of them, this was no accident. The server girl returned with a pitcher of water, hands trembling so badly that half of it splashed onto the floor before Elena managed to catch the rest in a cup. She tilted the young man's head back gently, careful not to let him swallow wrong, and poured small amounts past his lips, coaxing his body to reject what it had taken in. "Come on," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "Come on, breathe through it." The young man's back arched, and for a terrible second, Elena thought she had lost him. Then his body convulsed once more, violently, and he retched onto the floor, expelling the poisoned wine along with everything else in his stomach. His breathing, ragged and shallow only moments before, began to even out. Elena did not celebrate. She kept working, checking his pulse again, watching his eyes for signs of the fog that sometimes followed a poisoning even after the immediate danger had passed. Minutes stretched by. The hall, which had been filled with panicked murmurs, slowly quieted as people realized the young man was breathing steadily now, his color returning, his eyes fluttering open in confusion and exhaustion. "You're going to be fine," Elena told him softly. "You gave everyone quite a fright, but you're going to be fine." It was only then, as she finally allowed herself to exhale, that she became aware of being watched. Not by the crowd, whose attention had already begun drifting toward gossip and speculation about who might have poisoned the wine and why. Not by the elders, who were beginning to shuffle forward now that the danger had passed, eager to appear useful after doing nothing at all. Someone else was watching her, and the weight of that gaze was different, heavier, more deliberate. She looked up and found him standing at the edge of the crowd. He was tall in a way that seemed almost unnatural, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair swept back from a face carved from sharp, unforgiving lines. His eyes were a pale, startling gray, the color of a winter sky right before snow, and they were fixed on her with an intensity that made her suddenly, acutely aware of the sweat on her brow, and the poison-stained water soaking into the knees of her dress. She knew who he was, of course. Everyone in the hall knew who he was. King Draven Voss, Alpha King of the Northern Territories, ruler of a domain so vast and so feared that pack leaders 3 regions away spoke his name in careful, measured tones. He had arrived that morning with his delegation to negotiate a treaty with Ashwood, a treaty that would determine trade routes, hunting boundaries, and the safety of every wolf in the pack for the next generation. And he was staring at her, as though she were the only person in the entire hall. Elena rose to her feet, smoothing down her ruined skirt with hands that were not quite steady, though she told herself it was only exhaustion. "Your Majesty," she said, dipping her head in a respectful bow, the way she had been taught since she was a child. He did not respond immediately. His gaze flicked briefly to the young man now being helped to his feet by two others, then back to her, as though reassessing something. "You saved his life," Draven said finally. His voice was low, rough at the edges, the kind of voice that seemed to vibrate in her chest rather than simply reach her ears. "I did what anyone with the training would have done," Elena replied, though she knew that was not entirely true. Anyone with the training might have known what to do. Very few would have moved that fast, without hesitation, without waiting for permission, or for someone braver to go first. "No," Draven said, and something in his tone made the word land with more weight than she expected. "Not anyone." Before she could respond, the pack alpha, a broad-shouldered man named Victor Hale, pushed his way through the gathered crowd, his face flushed with a mixture of relief and mortification. "Your Majesty, I am so deeply sorry for this disruption. Please, allow us to escort you somewhere quieter while we investigate." "I would like to speak with her first," Draven said, cutting him off without raising his voice, though the words carried an authority that silenced Victor instantly. Victor blinked, glancing at Elena as though seeing her for the first time, though she had lived in this pack her entire life, and had healed half the wolves standing in that hall at one point or another. "Her? She is only our healer, Your Majesty. A skilled one, certainly, but there are more suitable women I could introduce you to, women of status, women closer to." "I said I would like to speak with her," Draven repeated, and this time, there was an edge to his voice that made Victor's mouth snap shut. Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, though whether from embarrassment or something else entirely, she could not say. She was used to being spoken over. She was used to being introduced as an afterthought, the healer, the woman who had never married, the one who had passed the age when the pack considered a woman worth noticing. It had stopped stinging years ago, or so she had told herself, though moments like this one proved that the old wound had never fully healed. It had simply gone quiet, waiting. Draven stepped closer, and the crowd around them seemed to part instinctively, giving him space the way water gives space to a stone dropped into a still pond. Up close, Elena could see the faint scar that traced along his jawline, could see the tension held in his shoulders even now, in a moment that should have called for relief rather than vigilance. "What is your name?" he asked. "Elena Marsh." "Elena," he repeated, as though testing the shape of it in his mouth. "You knew immediately it was poison, before anyone told you what he had eaten." His symptoms suggested it. The suddenness, the convulsions, the way his pulse fought against itself. "I have seen poisoning before." "Recently?" Elena hesitated. It was not a question she had expected, and something about the sharpness in his gray eyes told her the answer mattered more than she understood. "Not recently. Years ago, during a conflict with a neighboring pack. I was much younger then, and much less skilled. I lost more patience than I saved. And now? Now I rarely lose anyone," she said simply, because it was the truth, and she had learned long ago that false modesty served no one, least of all the people who depended on her. Something shifted in Draven's expression, something that was not quite a smile, but was warmer than the guarded neutrality he had worn since entering the hall. "I would like you to examine the wine that was poisoned, and anything else served at the guest table tonight. If someone attempted to harm a member of my delegation, I need to know how, and I need to know quickly." Elena glanced toward Victor, who was watching this exchange with an expression caught somewhere between confusion and alarm, clearly unsettled by the idea of the visiting king taking a personal interest in the pack's unassuming healer, rather than in the daughters of the pack's most prominent families, several of whom Elena could see hovering nearby, straightening their gowns in case his attention should finally land on them. "Of course, Your Majesty," Elena said. "I will need to collect samples before the kitchen staff clear away the evidence." "Then let us not waste time," Draven said, and to the visible shock of nearly everyone in the hall, he fell into step beside her, as she made her way toward the kitchen, leaving behind a wave of whispers that rippled through the crowd, like wind through tall grass. Elena kept her eyes forward, refusing to acknowledge the stares, though she could feel them pressing against her back from every direction. She had spent 20 years learning to be invisible in this hall, to move through gatherings like this one unnoticed, valued only for the tinctures she brewed and the wounds she stitched. She had made peace with that invisibility a long time ago. But walking beside the Alpha King, feeling the quiet intensity of his attention, as though it were a physical thing settling over her shoulders, Elena understood with sudden, unsettling clarity that whatever peace she had made with her place in the world was about to be tested in ways she could not yet predict. Behind them, Victor Hale watched with narrowed eyes, already calculating how this unexpected turn might disrupt the careful plans he had spent months preparing. And somewhere in the shadows near the edge of the hall, unseen by anyone, a pair of eyes tracked Elena's retreating figure with an interest far less benevolent than the king's, marking her as a problem that would need to be dealt with before the night was through. The poisoning, it seemed, had not been an accident at all, and Elena Marsh, healer, 42 years old, long dismissed as unremarkable by everyone who had ever known her, had just become far more important than anyone in that hall could have imagined. The kitchen was warm and cramped, filled with the smell of roasted meat and simmering broth. Though the usual clatter of pots and hurried voices had gone strangely quiet, the kitchen staff stood pressed against the far wall, watching with wide eyes as Elena approached the long wooden table where the serving trays had been left, still holding the remnants of the evening's feast. "Do not touch anything," Elena said firmly, and the staff nodded quickly, none of them daring to argue with the healer who had just pulled a man back from the edge of death in front of the entire hall. She found the silver tray easily enough, set apart from the others near the edge of the table, 3 empty cups arranged upon it, along with 1 half-full cup that had clearly been abandoned in haste. She lifted it carefully, holding it beneath her nose, and caught the faint bitterness beneath the wine's sweetness, a smell so subtle that most people would never have noticed it at all. "Wolfsbane," she said quietly. "A very small amount, carefully measured. Enough to cause severe illness, perhaps even death in someone smaller or weaker, but not obvious enough to alter the taste of the wine to someone who was not looking for it." Draven stepped closer, studying the cup in her hands with an expression that had grown colder, harder, the warmth from moments earlier, replaced by something calculating. Someone with knowledge of poisons prepared this, someone who understood exactly how much to use and precisely where to place it. "Yes," Elena agreed. "This was not the work of an amateur." "The tray was meant for my delegation," Draven said, his jaw tightening. 3 cups poured for my advisors, 1 for myself. That young man was not meant to drink from it at all." Elena looked up sharply. "He took the cup by mistake?" "He is not part of my delegation," Draven confirmed. "I do not know him. He must have reached for the tray without realizing it was reserved." The weight of that realization settled over the kitchen like a held breath. If the young man had taken the poisoned cup by accident, then the true target had been someone standing at that guest table, someone important enough to warrant this kind of careful, deliberate attack. Someone connected to the king himself, or perhaps the king directly. "Who else knew which tray was meant for your table?" Elena asked, setting the cup down carefully, and turning to study the kitchen staff still huddled against the wall. "The serving staff, certainly," Draven said. "Anyone who observed the arrangements closely enough this afternoon." Elena approached the staff slowly, her voice gentle but firm, the same tone she used with frightened patients who needed to trust her before they would tell her the truth. "I am not here to accuse anyone. I only need to understand what happened tonight so that no one else gets hurt. Who prepared the wine for the guest table?" A young man near the back, thin and nervous, finally stepped forward. His hands trembled as he spoke. "I poured the wine, but I did not add anything to it. I swear on my life, I only poured what I was given from the cellar." "Show me where the wine came from," Elena said. The young man led her and Draven through a narrow passage behind the kitchen, down a short flight of stone steps into a cool cellar, lined with barrels and bottles. He pointed toward a small cask set apart from the others, its lid slightly ajar. Draven crouched beside it, running his fingers along the rim, and Elena watched his expression shift into something sharp and focused, the look of a man accustomed to hunting threats far more dangerous than poisoned wine. This was not sealed properly. Someone opened it after it was brought down here. "Who has access to this cellar?" Elena asked. The young man's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "Anyone who works in the kitchen. And the household staff who serve the Alpha's private chambers. It is not locked during the evening, not while preparations are underway." Elena exchanged a glance with Draven, and for a moment neither of them spoke, both turning the same unsettling possibility over in their minds. Whoever had tampered with the wine had known the household well enough to move through it without suspicion, had known exactly which cask would end up on the tray meant for the king's table, and had timed the poisoning to occur during the chaos and noise of the welcoming feast, when attention would be scattered and difficult to gather. This was planned, Draven said quietly, not by an outsider, but by someone with knowledge of this house. I will need to speak with your alpha, Elena said. He will want to know that the threat may be closer than any of us assumed. Draven straightened, studying her for a long moment in the dim cellar light, the shadows carving deeper lines across his face. You handled tonight with more composure than most trained warriors I have commanded. Most people freeze when death is in front of them. You did not. I have had a great deal of practice, Elena said, though there was no boastfulness in it, only the plain honesty of someone who had spent decades doing difficult work without recognition. How long have you served as this pack's healer? Since I was 17. My mother trained me before she passed, and her mother trained her. It has always been our family's place within the pack. And in all that time, has anyone thanked you the way you deserve to be thanked? The question caught her off guard, and for a moment, Elena did not know how to answer. It was not the kind of question anyone asked her, not in this pack, not among people who had grown so accustomed to her quiet competence that they had stopped seeing it as remarkable at all. The people I heal are usually grateful, she said carefully. That has always been enough. It should not have to be enough, Draven said, and something in the low certainty of his voice settled into her chest in a way she did not fully understand, a warmth that felt dangerous, precisely because she had not expected to feel it at all. Not here, not from a king who was supposed to be choosing a bride among the pack's younger, more celebrated daughters. Before she could respond, hurried footsteps echoed down the stone steps, and Victor Hale appeared at the base of the cellar stairs, his face pale and anxious. Your Majesty, I must insist you return upstairs where it is safe. If there is truly a threat within this household, I cannot allow you to remain exposed like this. I am hardly in danger, Alpha Hale, Draven said, his tone cool and unbothered. But you are right, that we should continue this conversation elsewhere. Elena, I would like you to join us. Your observations tonight may prove essential. Victor's expression flickered with something close to panic, quickly smoothed over into forced politeness. Of course, Your Majesty, if that is your wish. Though surely one of my senior advisors would be better suited to accompany such an important discussion. I have already made my choice, Draven said simply, and there was a finality in his voice that left no room for further argument. As they climbed the stairs back toward the great hall, Elena felt the weight of the evening settling over her, heavier with every step. The poisoning. The cellar left carelessly unsealed, the king's unexpected, unwavering attention. Nothing about tonight had unfolded the way she expected when she woke that morning, preparing herself for another quiet feast where she would serve tea in the corner and remain unseen. She did not yet understand what any of it meant, only that something had shifted, quietly and irrevocably, the moment she knelt beside a dying stranger and refused to let him go. Whatever came next, she suspected her life in Ashwood would never return to the comfortable invisibility she had known before. The private meeting room smelled of smoke and old parchment, lit by a fire that crackled in the stone hearth, while a dozen candles flickered along the long table, where Ashwood's senior advisors had gathered in a hurry, their faces still tight with the shock of the evening's events. Elena stood near the back of the room, uncertain of her place among them, her hands clasped tightly in front of her to stop them from trembling. She had healed wounds in this pack for 25 years, but she had never once been invited into a room like this, where decisions about the pack's future were made behind closed doors, by men who rarely acknowledged her existence, beyond a nod of thanks, after she stitched their injuries. We must assume this was an attempt to sabotage the treaty, Victor Hale said, pacing before the fire with his hands clasped behind his back. Someone wants to see negotiations fail, and they were willing to risk a member of the royal delegation to make that happen. Or someone wanted to see me dead before negotiations even began, Draven said from where he sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. Either possibility should concern you equally, Alpha Hale. Victor's pacing faltered. Of course, Your Majesty. I only meant. I understand what you meant. Draven's gaze shifted toward Elena, and the room seemed to hold its breath as every advisor turned to follow his attention. Elena, tell them what you found in the cellar. Elena stepped forward, aware of the weight of a dozen unfamiliar eyes settling on her, some curious, some faintly hostile, as though her presence in this room were an insult to the importance of the conversation. She kept her voice steady, the same voice she used when delivering difficult news to worried families. The wine was tampered with using wolfsbane, measured carefully enough to avoid detection by taste. Whoever did this understood both poisons and people. They knew exactly how much to use, and they knew the cellar would be unguarded during the feast preparations. "That could describe half this household," muttered a thin, sharp-featured man seated near Victor's right hand, a senior advisor named Edmund Cole, who Elena recognized as one of the pack's most influential voices. Kitchen staff, household servants, even members of the delegation itself who arrived early and had time to familiarize themselves with the estate. It could describe half this household, Elena agreed, but not all of them would know that wolfsbane, in that precise measurement, causes violent illness without killing quickly. That knowledge is rare. It belongs to healers, to those trained in poisons, for medicine, or for war, or to someone who consulted such a person beforehand. Edmund's eyes narrowed slightly, and Elena felt the accusation before he spoke it aloud. "You would know that measurement well yourself, would you not? As the pack's healer?" The room went quiet. Elena felt heat rise in her chest, not from embarrassment this time, but from something closer to anger, carefully banked and controlled the way she had learned to control every emotion that threatened to interfere with her work. "I would know it well, yes, as would anyone who trained under my mother, or her mother before her. If you are suggesting I poisoned a man, I then spent 20 minutes saving in front of the entire hall, I would ask you to consider what possible reason I might have for doing so." "Enough," Draven said, and the single word carried enough weight to silence the room entirely. He rose from his chair, his gaze fixed on Edmund with an intensity that made the older man shrink back slightly in his seat. "Elena Marsh saved the life of a man tonight, while every other person in that hall stood frozen. If you wish to accuse someone of conspiring against my delegation, I suggest you look toward those who benefit from this treaty failing, rather than the one person who acted to prevent further harm." Edmund inclined his head stiffly. "My apologies, Your Majesty. I meant no disrespect." Elena said nothing, though she allowed herself a small measure of relief at the king's swift defense. It was not something she was accustomed to, having someone stand between her and the casual cruelty of assumption. In this pack, she had long ago learned to defend herself, quietly and without complaint, because no one else ever thought to do it for her. "Who benefits from this treaty failing?" Draven asked, turning his attention back to the room at large. "I want names. I want every possibility considered, no matter how unlikely." Victor cleared his throat, resuming his seat at the table with visible reluctance. "There are pack leaders to the east, who have long resented Ashwood's growing influence under this alliance. If our territory strengthens its bond with the northern territories, their own bargaining position weakens considerably." "Any of them present in this house tonight?" Draven asked. "None that I am aware of," Victor said, though something in his tone made Elena glance at him more carefully, a flicker of hesitation that seemed at odds with the confidence of his words. "What about within Ashwood itself?" Elena asked quietly, surprising herself with the boldness of the question. Every head turned toward her again, and she forced herself to continue despite the discomfort of so much attention. "Forgive me, but it seems worth asking who within this pack might resent the treaty as strongly as any outside rival. Trade agreements often benefit some families more than others. If certain households stand to lose influence or wealth once this alliance is finalized, that resentment could easily curdle into something dangerous." Silence stretched across the table. Draven's gaze remained fixed on her, something like approval flickering behind the winter gray of his eyes, while several of the advisors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging glances that suggested her question had struck closer to the truth than any of them wished to admit aloud. "That is a fair point," Draven said finally. "Alpha Hale, I would like a complete accounting of which families within Ashwood stand to lose from this treaty, and which stand to gain. I want it before tomorrow evening." "Of course, Your Majesty," Victor said, though his jaw had tightened, and Elena noticed the faint sheen of sweat that had gathered along his hairline despite the coolness of the room. The meeting continued for another hour, circling through possibilities and contingencies, security measures to be doubled, guards to be posted at the cellar and the kitchen, every servant to be questioned individually in the coming days. Elena spoke little after that, content to listen and observe, cataloging details the way she catalogues symptoms in a difficult patient, searching for the pattern beneath the surface. She noticed the way Edmund Cole's eyes kept flicking toward Victor Hale whenever the subject of internal suspects arose, as though seeking some silent agreement between them. She noticed the way Victor's hands trembled slightly when he lifted his cup of water, a small tremor easily missed, unless one had spent decades learning to read the body's smallest signals. She noticed, too, the careful way both men avoided mentioning a name that seemed to hover at the edges of the conversation, unspoken but present, like a shadow no one wanted to acknowledge directly. When the meeting finally ended, and the advisors began filing out of the room, murmuring among themselves, Draven remained seated, watching Elena with an expression she could not quite decipher. "You noticed something tonight," he said once the room had emptied, leaving only the two of them and the dying fire in the hearth. "Something you did not say aloud." Elena hesitated, weighing the wisdom of voicing suspicions she could not yet prove, but something about the directness of his gaze made her trust him, or perhaps it was simply exhaustion, loosening her usual caution. Alpha Hale seemed uneasy whenever the conversation turned toward internal suspects. It could mean nothing. Many people grow anxious when accused, even indirectly, of harboring a traitor within their household. But it could also mean he already suspects someone and is reluctant to name them. Or he is protecting someone, Draven said. Or that, Elena agreed quietly. Draven rose from his chair and crossed the room slowly, stopping a respectful distance from where she stood, though close enough that she became acutely aware of his height, the breadth of his shoulders, the quiet, contained power that seemed to radiate from him even in stillness. "I would like you to remain close to this investigation, Elena, not simply as a healer, called upon when someone is injured, but as someone whose judgment I trust." "I am only the Pax healer, Your Majesty. I have no experience with matters of politics or investigation." "You have experience with people," Draven said. "You notice what others miss because you have spent your life being overlooked yourself, which means you have learned to watch carefully, rather than assume you already understand what you are seeing. That is a rarer skill than you realize, and far more valuable to me right now than titles or status." Elena felt something unfamiliar bloom in her chest at his words, a warmth she was unprepared for and unsure how to name. She had spent so many years accepting her place at the margins of pack life that she had nearly forgotten what it felt like to be truly seen, not for what she could offer in terms of medicine or duty, but for the sharpness of her mind, the quality of her attention. "I will help however I can," she said finally. "Good," Draven said, and something in the corner of his mouth suggested the beginning of a smile, quickly restrained but not entirely hidden. "Then I will expect you at first light tomorrow. We have a great deal of work ahead of us, and very little time before the formal negotiations begin." As Elena made her way back through the quiet corridors of the estate toward her small cottage at the pack's edge, she passed a cluster of young women gathered near the courtyard, their voices dropping to whispers the moment they noticed her, though not quietly enough to hide their words entirely. She caught fragments of the conversation as she passed, laughter, poorly disguised as concern, speculation about why the king would waste his time with someone so far past the age he was expected to consider for marriage. Elena kept her expression neutral and her pace steady, refusing to let them see how the words landed, though old wounds ached faintly beneath her composure. She had endured worse than whispered mockery over the years, and she told herself firmly that whatever attention the king had shown her tonight was born of necessity, not interest, a practical alliance forged in crisis rather than anything deeper. But as she reached her cottage and closed the door behind her, sinking into the familiar quiet of her own home, she found herself thinking of the way Draven had looked at her in that meeting room, the genuine weight he had given her words, the quiet certainty in his voice when he called her judgment valuable. It had been a very long time since anyone had made her feel that her presence mattered beyond the practical use of her hands. She told herself not to dwell on it. She told herself, as she banked the fire and prepared for a restless night's sleep, that tomorrow would bring nothing more than further investigation, further questions, further proof that whatever she had felt in that room was simply gratitude misread as something more significant. She was not entirely sure she believed herself. Sleep came slowly that night, her mind circling through the events of the evening long after her body had grown heavy with exhaustion. She thought of the young man's pulse fluttering beneath her fingers, of the bitter smell of wolfsbane clinging to the abandoned cup, of Edmund Cole's narrowed eyes and Victor Hale's trembling hands. She thought, more than she wished to admit, of the low certainty in Draven's voice when he had called her judgment valuable, as though her opinion carried weight simply because it was hers. She was startled from these thoughts by a soft, deliberate sound near her front door, a scrape of something being pushed beneath it rather than a knock. Elena sat up immediately, every instinct honed by decades of tending emergencies in the dead of night snapping into alertness. She rose from her bed, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and crossed the small cottage in silence, listening for footsteps outside that never came. When she reached the door, she found a folded scrap of parchment lying just inside the threshold, as though it had been slipped beneath the gap with careful precision. She hesitated only a moment before picking it up, unfolding it with fingers that had gone suddenly cold. The message was short, written in a hurried, uneven hand that told her nothing about its author beyond a certain urgency. It read simply, "Stop asking questions you do not understand, or the next poison will not miss its true target." Elena read the words twice, her heart pounding steadily against her ribs, and then a third time, forcing herself to think rather than react. Whoever had written this note knew she had been present in the meeting room. They knew, or suspected, that she had raised the question of internal suspects, the very question that had made Victor Hale's hands tremble and Edmund Cole's eyes narrow with something close to alarm. Someone in that room, or someone connected closely enough to hear what had been said there, wanted her to stop looking too closely at the truth. She thought immediately of going to Draven, of carrying the note straight to him despite the late hour, but something made her pause. If the warning had come from someone within the pack's own household, someone with access to information from that private meeting, then trusting the wrong person with this note could put her in greater danger, rather than less. She needed to think carefully about who she could trust before she acted. She folded the parchment and tucked it into the drawer of her small writing desk, beside the pouches of dried herbs and the worn leather journal where she recorded every patient she had ever treated. She did not sleep again that night, sitting instead near the dying embers of her fire, turning the thread over in her mind again and again, searching for a shape to the danger that had suddenly, unmistakably, attached itself to her. By the time the first pale light of dawn crept through her window, Elena had made her decision. She would tell Draven, but she would choose her moment carefully, away from the ears of advisors whose loyalties she could no longer take for granted. Whatever threat had been set into motion the night before, it was clear now that her involvement in the investigation had already marked her as someone worth silencing. And Elena Marsh, who had spent 42 years being underestimated by nearly everyone around her, found that the fear settling in her chest was matched, in equal measure, by a quiet, stubborn resolve to find out exactly who wanted her to stay silent, and why. The knock on Elena's door came just as the sun cleared the tree line, sharp and urgent enough that she nearly dropped the cup of tea she had been holding since dawn without tasting a single sip of it. She opened the door to find a young guard she recognized vaguely from the estate, his face flushed from running. "Healer Marsh, the king requests your presence immediately. Another member of the delegation has fallen ill." Elena's stomach dropped. She grabbed her satchel of herbs and bandages from beside the door, and followed the guard at a near run through the quiet morning streets of the pack's central grounds, her mind already cataloging possibilities, Wolfsbane again, or something new entirely, a second attempt disguised to look unrelated to the first. She found Draven standing outside a guest chamber, his arms crossed and his jaw set in a hard, controlled line that told her more about his state of mind than any words could have. Two of his personal guards flanked the doorway, and through the open door Elena could see an older man lying on the bed, his face pale, sweat beading along his hairline despite the coolness of the morning. "What happened?" Elena asked, moving past Draven without waiting for permission. "Advisor Wren woke an hour ago, complaining of dizziness and stomach pain," Draven said, following her into the room. "It worsened quickly. I did not want to wait for you to be summoned properly. I sent someone immediately." Elena knelt beside the bed and began her examination, checking the man's pulse, the color beneath his eyelids, the dryness of his tongue. The symptoms were similar to the poisoning from 2 nights before, but subtly different, less violent, slower in its progression. "Has he eaten or drunk anything unusual this morning?" "Only the tea brought to his room. Same as every morning," Draven said. "Bring me the pot," Elena said, and one of the guards hurried away to retrieve it. While she waited, she continued her examination, pressing gently along the advisor's abdomen, checking his breathing, noting the faint tremor in his hands that suggested his body was fighting against something introduced gradually, rather than all at once. When the guard returned with the teapot, Elena lifted the lid and inhaled carefully, catching a faint bitterness beneath the usual fragrance of the leaves, different from wolfsbane but no less deliberate. This has been treated with foxglove, in small doses. Someone has likely been dosing his tea gradually over several days, rather than attempting a single dramatic poisoning like the wine at the feast. Draven's expression darkened. Days. That means whoever did this had access to his private chambers repeatedly, not just once during the chaos of a public gathering. Yes, Elena said, already reaching into her satchel for the herbs she would need to counter the poison's effects. She worked quickly, preparing a bitter tonic that would help flush the foxglove from his system, coaxing the advisor to drink it in careful, measured sips, despite his weak protests. It took the better part of an hour before his color began to improve, and his pulse steadied beneath her fingers. He will recover, Elena said finally, sitting back on her heels, exhaustion pulling at the edges of her focus. But he must not drink anything prepared in this house again, until we understand who has access to his chambers. Draven nodded, already turning to issue instructions to his guards, his voice low and controlled, despite the fury Elena could sense simmering beneath his composure. Once the guards had dispersed to secure the chamber and question the household staff, he turned back to her, and for a moment, the mask of authority slipped just slightly, revealing something rawer underneath. 2 attempts in 3 days, he said quietly. Whoever is behind this does not intend to stop. No, Elena agreed. And they are patient enough to use slow poisons as well as fast ones, which tells me they are either testing different approaches to see which succeeds, or they have multiple targets in mind and are working through them methodically. Draven's gray eyes settled on her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken despite the exhaustion weighing on her body. There is something I should tell you. Something happened last night that I have not yet mentioned to Alpha Hale or his advisors. Elena went still, her thoughts immediately jumping to the note she had found slipped beneath her own door, the warning that had kept her awake through the long hours of darkness. What happened? A guard posted outside my chambers reported seeing someone moving near the eastern wing after midnight, someone who fled when challenged rather than identifying themselves. We found nothing when we searched the area, but it confirms what I already suspected. Whoever orchestrated these poisonings is moving freely through this household, unafraid of being caught. Elena hesitated only a moment before reaching into the pocket of her dress and withdrawing the folded parchment she had carried with her since dawn, unable to decide, until this exact moment, whether she trusted him enough to share it. She held it out to him without a word. Draven unfolded it slowly, his expression shifting from confusion to something colder, sharper, as he read the warning scrawled across the page. When did you receive this? Last night. Someone slipped it beneath my door while I slept, though I did not hear them approach or leave. Why did you not bring this to me immediately? Because I did not know who I could trust with it, Elena admitted honestly. If the threat came from someone connected to the advisors present in that meeting room, I did not want to risk delivering it into the wrong hands. Something flickered across Draven's face, understanding mixed with a flash of anger that Elena suspected was not directed at her at all. You were right to be cautious, but you should know now that you can trust me with information like this, regardless of the hour or the circumstance. If someone is threatening you because of your involvement in this investigation, I need to know immediately. I am telling you now, Elena said simply. Draven studied her for a long moment, the anger in his expression slowly giving way to something quieter, more troubled. I should not have asked you to remain close to this investigation without considering the danger it might bring to you. If I had known, I would have agreed regardless, Elena interrupted gently. I have spent my life caring for this pack, Your Majesty. If someone within it is willing to poison innocent people to disrupt a treaty meant to protect us all, then I want to help stop them, whatever the risk to myself. Draven's expression softened into something Elena had rarely seen directed at her, a look that felt less like the careful respect of a king toward a valued advisor, and more like genuine concern for her well-being. You are not what I expected to find in this pack, he said quietly. What did you expect to find? I am not entirely certain, Draven admitted. Perhaps nothing at all. I came here prepared to negotiate a treaty, and select a suitable match among your pack's eligible women, as tradition demands of visiting kings seeking alliance through marriage. I did not expect to find someone whose competence and courage outmatched every other person in that hall, someone the pack itself seemed determined to overlook. Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, unsure how to respond to words that landed somewhere between gratitude and something far more unsettling. The pack has its reasons for overlooking me. I am not young, Your Majesty. I am not the kind of match that alliances like this are typically built upon. And yet, you are the only person in this household I have found myself trusting since I arrived, Draven said, his voice low and steady. That is not a small thing, Elena, whatever the pack believes you're worth to be. Before she could respond, footsteps approached from the corridor, and one of the guards appeared in the doorway, his expression tense. Your Majesty, Alpha Hale requests your presence. He says it concerns the household staff questioning. Draven's jaw tightened, the warmth in his expression retreating behind the familiar mask of authority. I will come immediately. He turned back to Elena before leaving, his gaze lingering a moment longer than necessary. Stay close today, if you are willing. I would feel far better knowing you were within reach, given the warning you received. I will stay close, Elena agreed. As she watched him disappear down the corridor, his broad shoulders set with the weight of responsibility that never seemed to leave him, Elena found herself thinking of his words, the plain, unguarded honesty of them, so different from the careful flattery she had grown accustomed to hearing from men who wanted something from her, whether it was medicine or labor or simple obedience. Draven Voss wanted none of those things. He wanted her judgment, her honesty, her presence, and the strangeness of being valued for exactly who she was, rather than what she could provide, left her feeling unmoored, in a way she had not experienced in longer than she could remember. She gathered her satchel and made her way toward the household staff quarters, determined to help however she could, though the memory of his words followed her through the morning, like warmth she could not quite shake, however hard she tried to convince herself it meant nothing at all. The staff quarters were crowded with servants lined up along the corridor, waiting their turn to be questioned by two of Victor Hale's senior guards, their faces a mixture of nervousness and resentment at being treated with suspicion after years of loyal service. Elena took a seat near the end of the hallway, close enough to listen without interrupting, hoping her presence might put some of the younger staff at ease when their turn came. A woman named Grace, who had worked in the household kitchens for as long as Elena could remember, was the first to notice her sitting there. Grace's face brightened with relief. Healer Marsh, thank goodness. Perhaps you can explain to these guards that none of us would ever harm a guest under this roof. We have served this family faithfully for years. I believe you, Elena said gently. No one thinks the staff as a whole is responsible. We only need to understand who had access to certain rooms and certain hours, so that we can rule out as many people as possible and narrow our search to whoever is truly guilty. Grace nodded, though her hands twisted nervously in her apron. It is only that Advisor Wren's chambers are cleaned each morning by whoever is assigned that day. It changes. I could not tell you who was assigned this week without checking the schedule myself. Would you be willing to show me that schedule? Elena asked. Of course, Grace said, clearly relieved to have something useful to offer. As Grace hurried off to retrieve the household ledger, Elena became aware of hushed voices further down the corridor, two young women she recognized as daughters of prominent pack families, Charlotte Ames and her cousin Margaret, both of whom had been paraded before the king during the welcoming feast in gowns clearly chosen to catch his attention. They had not noticed Elena sitting nearby, or perhaps they simply did not care whether she overheard them. I still cannot understand why he spent half the night speaking with her, Charlotte was saying, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry. She is old enough to be his aunt. Surely he only humored her, because she happened to be the one kneeling beside that poor man when he collapsed. It will not last, Margaret replied, a note of satisfaction in her voice. Kings do not marry healers twice their age, however clever she pretends to be. Once the investigation settles, he will remember why he came here in the first place, and it certainly was not to consult with someone the pack has never once considered worth courting. Elena kept her eyes fixed on the ledger Grace had returned with, her expression carefully neutral despite the familiar sting settling beneath her ribs. She had heard variations of these words for most of her adult life, spoken behind hands or half hidden by polite smiles, the persistent, quiet cruelty of a pack that had decided long ago what her worth was, and had never once bothered to reconsider it. She had told herself years ago that such words no longer had the power to wound her, and mostly, that had been true. But hearing them now, in the middle of an investigation that had already cost her a night's sleep, and a threatening note slipped beneath her door, the old ache returned with unwelcome familiarity. She forced her attention back to the ledger, scanning the names listed beside each morning's assignments, and felt a small jolt of recognition when she found the entry for that week. The name written beside Advisor Wren's chambers, 3 mornings running, was one she recognized immediately: Nathaniel Cole, a young household servant who happened to share a surname with Edmund Cole, the sharp-featured advisor who had accused her so pointedly in the meeting the night before. Elena's pulse quickened. It could easily be coincidence, a common surname shared by unrelated families, but something told her the connection was worth investigating further before she dismissed it. She thanked Grace for her help, and rose from her seat, folding the relevant page of the ledger carefully, and tucking it into her satchel, alongside the threatening note she had received the night before. As she made her way back toward the estate's main hall, she passed close enough to Charlotte and Margaret that their whispered conversation faltered into an uncomfortable silence. Elena said nothing, offered no acknowledgement of what she had overheard, though she held her head a fraction higher as she walked past them, refusing to let their words shrink her the way they once might have. She thought of Draven's voice from earlier that morning, steady and certain, telling her she was not what he expected to find in this pack. Whatever came of the investigation, whatever came of the strange, unexpected warmth that had begun to grow between them, Elena found herself holding on to those words like a small flame cupped carefully against the wind, a reminder that perhaps, after so many years of being overlooked, someone had finally looked closely enough to see her clearly. She had a name now, a thread worth pulling: Nathaniel Cole. And she intended to find Draven before the day was through and share what she had discovered, whatever danger it might invite. Nathaniel Cole was nowhere to be found by the time Elena reached the estate's main hall, and the guards she spoke with reported that he had not appeared for his afternoon duties, an absence that struck her as far more suspicious than any answer he might have given if questioned directly. She found Draven in a small study near the eastern wing, bent over a scattering of documents, with Victor Hale standing stiffly beside him, their conversation cutting off abruptly the moment Elena appeared in the doorway. "Elena," Draven said, straightening immediately, his expression sharpening with attention the moment he saw the folded ledger page clutched in her hand. "You found something." "A name," she said, stepping into the room, despite Victor's obvious discomfort at her presence. "Nathaniel Cole has been assigned to clean Advisor Wren's chambers for the past 3 mornings. He shares a surname with Edmund Cole." Victor's face went pale, and for a moment, Elena thought he might object, might insist the connection meant nothing, but instead, he sank slowly into the nearest chair, pressing a hand against his forehead. "Nathaniel is Edmund's nephew. He has worked in this household since he was a boy, ever since his own parents passed. Edmund has always looked after him." "Where is he now?" Draven asked, his voice low and controlled in a way that made the temperature of the room seem to drop several degrees. "I do not know," Victor admitted. "I have not seen him since this morning." Draven turned to one of the guards stationed outside the study door. "Find him, quietly, if possible. I do not want him to know we suspect anything until we have the chance to question him properly." The guard nodded and disappeared down the corridor at a brisk pace, and Draven turned back to Elena, studying her with an intensity that made her acutely aware of how close he stood, close enough that she could see the faint tension still lingering in the set of his jaw from the morning's events. "This is good work, Elena. Better than anything my own investigators have managed in 3 days." "It may be nothing," Elena said carefully, though she did not entirely believe her own caution. "A shared surname does not prove guilt." "No," Draven agreed, "but it is the first solid thread we have had since this began, and I intend to follow it." Victor rose from his chair, some of his composure returning, though his hands still trembled faintly at his sides. "If Nathaniel is truly responsible, I cannot imagine what would have driven him to such an act. He has always been a quiet boy, devoted to his uncle, never once causing trouble within this household." "Devotion to family can be a powerful motive," Draven said. "If Edmund Cole believes this treaty threatens something he values, whether wealth, influence, or standing within this pack, it would not be difficult to convince a loyal nephew to act on his behalf." Elena thought of Edmund's narrowed eyes in the meeting room the night before. The pointed accusation he had leveled against her without hesitation. The way he had seemed almost eager to shift suspicion away from himself and toward anyone else in the room. Edmund seemed very quick to suggest I might be responsible for the poisoning. Perhaps that was not simple carelessness. Perhaps he wanted attention directed away from his own household before anyone thought to look closely at it. That would explain a great deal, Draven said, his gray eyes narrowing with the particular focus Elena had already come to associate with his most dangerous moods. I want Edmund Cole questioned as well, the moment his nephew is found. Victor hesitated, glancing between Elena and the king, with an expression caught somewhere between reluctance and resignation. Edmund has served this pack for over 20 years, Your Majesty. He was one of my father's most trusted advisors before he became mine. I find it difficult to believe he would risk everything to sabotage a treaty that benefits this entire pack, not merely a select few. Difficult to believe is not the same as impossible, Draven said, and given what has happened these past 3 days, I am no longer inclined to extend the benefit of the doubt to anyone within this household, regardless of their years of service. The room fell into an uneasy silence, broken only when the guard returned sooner than expected, his expression grim. Your Majesty, we found Nathaniel's quarters. He is not there, but we found this. He held out a small cloth pouch, the kind used to carry dried herbs, still faintly dusted with a fine, pale powder along its seams. Elena took the pouch carefully, opening it, and inhaling the faint, bitter scent that clung to the fabric. Foxglove, she confirmed. The same poison used against Advisor Wren. Draven's expression hardened into something cold and unyielding. Then we have our answer. Find him. I do not care how long it takes, or how many guards it requires. I want him found before nightfall. As the guard departed to organize a search, Draven turned to Elena, and for a moment, the fury in his expression softened into something quieter, an unspoken acknowledgement of the role she had played in uncovering the truth so quickly. You have done more for this investigation in 3 days than my own advisors managed in as many months of preparation for this treaty. I want your judgment on something else, something I have been considering since we spoke this morning. Of course, Elena said, curious despite the exhaustion weighing on her shoulders. The negotiations begin in 2 days, Draven said, gesturing toward the scattered documents on the desk before him, maps of trade routes, and carefully worded proposals covering land rights and hunting boundaries between Ashwood and the Northern Territories. I would like you to review these terms before the formal discussions begin, not as a healer, but as someone who understands this pack, its people, its true needs, better than any advisor currently sitting at that table. Victor's mouth opened, as though to protest, then closed again, apparently deciding against voicing whatever objection had risen to his lips. Elena felt the weight of the request settle over her, both an honor and a burden she had never expected to carry. I have no experience negotiating treaties, Your Majesty, she said honestly. I would not wish to offer advice that might harm this pack, rather than help it. I am not asking you to negotiate, Draven said. I am asking you to tell me the truth about what this pack actually needs, rather than what its advisors believe will best serve their own families and ambitions. You have spent your entire life tending to the people of Ashwood, healing farmers and hunters, and children alike, regardless of their standing. You understand this pack's true condition in a way that men seated comfortably around a council table for decades cannot. Elena studied him for a long moment, searching his expression for any hint of flattery or manipulation, but found only sincerity, plain and unguarded. If you truly wish my opinion, I will give it honestly, even if it contradicts what your advisors, or mine, believe to be best. That is exactly what I want, Draven said, and something in his voice carried a warmth that made her chest tighten in a way she was still not entirely comfortable acknowledging. They spent the remainder of the afternoon bent over the documents together, Draven explaining the terms of the proposed treaty, while Elena offered her observations, pointing out where certain trade restrictions might harm the pack's smaller farming families, even as they benefited the wealthier households represented by advisors like Victor and Edmund. She spoke of the winters when medicine had run short, because trade routes favored luxury goods over essential herbs, of hunters who struggled to feed their families, because boundary lines drawn by men who had never set foot in the forest failed to account for where game actually migrated each season. Draven listened to every word with careful attention, occasionally asking questions that revealed a depth of consideration Elena had not expected from a king known throughout the region for his fearsome reputation. By the time the candles had burned low and the study had grown dim with evening shadow, Elena realized she had spoken more freely and more honestly in that single afternoon than she had in years of careful, measured interactions with the pack's other leaders. "You see this pack more clearly than anyone I have spoken with since arriving," Draven said finally, setting down the document he had been reviewing. "I intend to revise several of these terms before the formal negotiations begin, based on what you have told me today." "I am glad to have been useful," Elena said, though the word useful felt somehow insufficient for what had passed between them that afternoon. A kind of partnership she had never imagined herself capable of sharing with anyone, let alone a king. "You are far more than useful, Elena," Draven said quietly, and the directness of his gaze made her breath catch in a way she was entirely unprepared for. "I hope you know that by now." Before she could find the words to respond, a sharp knock interrupted them, and a guard appeared in the doorway, breathless from running. "Your Majesty, we found him. Nathaniel Cole. He is being held in the eastern courtyard, but he says he will only speak if the healer is present." Elena's heart quickened, uncertain what to make of such a request, while Draven rose immediately, his expression shifting back into the sharp, focused authority of a king facing a crisis. "Then we will not keep him waiting," he said, and together they made their way toward the courtyard, the warmth of the afternoon's conversation giving way once more to the urgency of the investigation that had brought them together in the first place. The eastern courtyard was lit by torches when they arrived, casting long shadows across the stone walls as two guards flanked a young man seated on a low bench, his hands bound loosely in front of him, his face pale and drawn with fear rather than defiance. Nathaniel Cole could not have been older than 20, Elena guessed, his thin frame trembling slightly beneath a jacket too large for his shoulders, and something about his obvious terror struck her as different from the calculated coldness she might have expected from someone capable of poisoning two people in cold blood. "You asked for the healer," Draven said, his voice carrying the weight of authority, even as he kept a careful distance, allowing Elena to approach first. Nathaniel looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and glassy, and when he spoke his voice cracked with something close to desperation. "Healer Marsh, please. You have to believe me. I did not want to do it. My uncle told me it was only meant to make Advisor Wren sick enough to delay the negotiations, nothing more. He swore no one would die." Elena knelt slightly, bringing herself closer to his eye level, softening her voice the way she did with frightened patients who needed gentleness before they could offer honesty. "Tell me exactly what your uncle asked you to do, Nathaniel. All of it. From the beginning." Nathaniel's breath hitched, and for a moment, Elena thought he might refuse. But then the words began pouring out of him in a rush, as though he had been holding them in for days, and could no longer bear the weight of silence. "He came to me 3 days ago, before the delegation even arrived, and told me the treaty would ruin our family's standing within the pack. He said Alpha Hale had promised our family certain trade privileges years ago that would be stripped away the moment this alliance with the North was finalized. He said if the negotiations were delayed, even disrupted enough to make the king reconsider the alliance, we could protect what our family had built." "And the wine at the feast?" Draven asked, stepping closer now, his voice deceptively calm, despite the tension coiled visibly in his shoulders. "That was not meant for anyone in particular," Nathaniel said, shaking his head miserably. "My uncle said if illness struck someone important during the feast, it would create enough chaos and suspicion to stall the treaty discussions, buy him time to gather support among the other pack families who felt similarly threatened. He never meant for it to nearly kill someone. I swear he did not intend that." "And yet it very nearly did," Elena said quietly, though there was no cruelty in her tone, only the plain, unavoidable truth of what his actions had caused. Nathaniel's shoulders crumpled, and tears began sliding silently down his face. "I know. I have not slept since that night, thinking of what almost happened. When my uncle asked me to continue with Advisor Wren's tea, I nearly refused. But he reminded me of everything our family owed him, everything he had done for me since my parents died. I did not know how to say no to him." Elena felt an unexpected pang of sympathy beneath her lingering anger, recognizing the particular kind of desperation that came from feeling trapped by obligation to family, however misguided that obligation had become. "Where is your uncle now, Nathaniel? This is your chance to make this right, as much as it can be made right." "I do not know," Nathaniel admitted. "He told me this morning that if anyone questioned me, I should say nothing and wait for him to send word. He said he had a plan to protect us both. I have not seen him since." Draven exchanged a sharp glance with the nearest guard, who immediately departed to relay orders for a search of Edmund Cole's chambers and known associates throughout the estate. "We will find him," Draven said, his voice carrying a certainty that left no room for doubt. "And when we do, he will answer for what he has done, not only to Advisor Wren, but to the innocent young man who nearly died drinking wine, meant for someone else entirely." Nathaniel flinched at the reminder, fresh tears spilling down his cheeks. "I never meant for anyone to nearly die. I only wanted to help my family." Elena rose slowly, studying the broken young man before her with a complicated mixture of anger and pity. He had made a terrible choice, one with consequences that could easily have cost lives, but he had also been manipulated by someone he trusted, someone who had exploited his loyalty and his grief for selfish gain. "You will need to answer for what you have done," she said gently, "but the truth you have given us tonight may go some way toward showing that you were led into this, rather than choosing it freely." Draven instructed the guards to take Nathaniel to a secure chamber rather than a cell, a small mercy Elena suspected owed something to her own quiet intervention, and as the young man was led away, still weeping, Draven turned to her with an expression heavy with the weight of the evening's revelations. "Edmund Cole has been sitting at that council table for 20 years, advising Victor Hale on matters of trade and diplomacy, and this entire time, he has been willing to poison innocent people to protect his family's private interests," Draven said, his voice low with barely restrained anger. "This is precisely the kind of betrayal that makes trust between packs so difficult to build." "Then we must find him quickly," Elena said, "before he decides that further desperate measures are necessary to protect himself, now that his nephew has been captured." Draven nodded grimly, already turning to organize the search that would stretch long into the night, and Elena found herself falling into step beside him once more, no longer merely a healer summoned to tend wounds, but a partner in uncovering a truth that threatened to unravel the fragile peace this pack had spent generations building. The search for Edmund Cole stretched through the night without success, and by the time the sun rose over Ashwood's grounds, Elena had not slept at all, her body running on the same restless energy that had carried her through countless emergencies over the years. She stood near the edge of the training yard as Draven's guards reported back one by one, each bringing the same disappointing news. Edmund's chambers had been found empty, his personal belongings hastily packed and removed sometime during the previous evening, as though he had anticipated discovery and prepared his escape well in advance. "He is resourceful," Draven said grimly, watching the last guard depart to continue the search along the pack's outer boundaries. He knew Nathaniel would eventually be found, and he made certain to be gone before that happened. "Which suggests he cared more for his own survival than his nephew's safety," Elena observed quietly, thinking of Nathaniel's tear-streaked face and the desperate loyalty that had led him into such a terrible mistake. "It does," Draven agreed, his jaw tightening. "Men like Edmund Cole rarely value anyone beyond their own ambitions, whatever loyalty they claim to feel toward family." Victor Hale approached them across the training yard, his face haggard from a sleepless night of his own, having spent the hours since Nathaniel's confession, combing through years of records, searching for any sign of Edmund's deeper involvement in the pack's affairs. "I have found something troubling," he said without preamble. "Records showing Edmund quietly acquired shares in several trade routes over the past 2 years, routes that would become significantly less profitable once this treaty grants the Northern Territories preferred access through Ashwood's borders. So he stood to lose a great deal personally, beyond any concern for the pack as a whole," Elena said. "It appears so," Victor admitted, shame evident in the slump of his shoulders. "I trusted him completely. I never once considered that his counsel might be shaped by private greed rather than genuine concern for Ashwood's welfare." Draven's expression remained hard, though when he spoke his voice carried less anger than measured resolve. "This is precisely why the terms of this treaty must be reconsidered carefully, Alpha Hale, with attention paid to who truly benefits and who does not. I do not intend to build an alliance that enriches a handful of ambitious advisors while leaving the rest of your pack vulnerable to their private schemes." Victor nodded, though his gaze drifted toward Elena with an expression that was difficult to read, something between reluctant respect and lingering discomfort at how thoroughly the balance of influence within his own household had shifted in the span of a few short days. Perhaps it would be wise to include Healer Marsh more formally in these discussions going forward, given how valuable her insight has already proven. That was already my intention, Draven said simply, and Elena felt a small flush of pride beneath her exhaustion, though she said nothing, aware of how carefully Victor was watching the exchange between them. As the morning wore on, and the search for Edmund continued without success, word of the previous night's events had clearly begun spreading through the pack, carried on the same current of gossip that had once mocked Elena's presence beside the king, and now, apparently, found new fuel in her role uncovering the conspiracy. She felt the shift in the way people looked at her as she crossed the estate grounds that afternoon, some with newfound curiosity, others with the same thinly veiled resentment she had grown accustomed to over the years, unwilling to reconsider their assumptions about her simply because circumstances had briefly placed her in the king's company. She found Charlotte Ames and several other young women gathered near the courtyard fountain that afternoon, their conversation falling into an uncomfortable hush as she passed, though this time the silence carried a different quality than before, less mocking and more calculating, as though they were reassessing a threat they had previously dismissed too quickly. "I heard she is the one who found Nathaniel Cole's poison pouch," one of the women murmured, apparently unaware or uncaring that Elena could still hear her from a short distance away. "Perhaps there is more to her than we assumed." "Do not be foolish," Charlotte replied, though her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Even if the king finds her useful during a crisis, that does not mean he intends anything beyond gratitude. Once this treaty is settled, he will return to selecting a proper wife, someone young enough to give him heirs and strong enough to stand beside him as queen." The words landed with a familiar sting, though Elena kept walking without acknowledging she had heard them, her spine straight despite the old, wearying ache that such conversations always stirred within her. She had spent decades accepting that her worth in this pack would always be measured by her usefulness rather than her presence, that no matter how many lives she saved, or how much wisdom she offered, there would always be someone ready to remind her that she did not fit the mold the pack expected of women deemed worthy of love, of partnership, of being chosen, rather than simply relied upon. She found herself thinking, unwillingly, of Draven's words from the previous afternoon, the warmth in his voice when he had called her far more than useful, and wondered whether Charlotte's assessment was closer to the truth than she wished to admit. Perhaps gratitude and crisis had simply blurred the lines of what she meant to him, and once Edmund Cole was captured and the treaty signed, she would return to her quiet cottage at the pack's edge, her role in his life reduced once more to the memory of a difficult week, rather than anything lasting. The thought settled uncomfortably in her chest as she made her way toward the healer's cottage to restock her supply of herbs, depleted after 2 days of treating poison victims and preparing tonics against further threats. She was halfway through sorting a fresh bundle of dried yarrow when a soft knock sounded at her door, and she opened it to find Draven standing there alone, without guards, his expression tired but softened in a way she had not seen since their conversation over the treaty documents. "I wanted to see how you were faring," he said. "You have had very little rest these past days, and I know this investigation has placed you in greater danger than I anticipated when I first asked for your help." "I am managing," Elena said, stepping aside to let him into the small cottage, aware of how strange it felt to have a king standing among her shelves of dried herbs and simple wooden furniture, so far removed from the grandeur of the estate's main hall. "Have there been any further sightings of Edmund?" "None yet," Draven admitted, his gaze drifting briefly around the cottage before returning to her. "But I did not come only to discuss the investigation." Elena felt her pulse quicken, uncertain what to make of the careful hesitation in his voice, so different from his usual measured confidence. "What else brings you here, Your Majesty?" "I overheard some of the talk circulating through the pack today," Draven said, and something in his tone suggested he had heard more than she wished him to know. "About you. About the assumptions people continue to make regarding your place beside me during this crisis." Elena's cheeks warmed, embarrassment coiling uncomfortably in her chest at the thought of him overhearing the same cruel speculation she had endured for years. "Pack gossip has never concerned me greatly, Your Majesty. People believe what they wish to believe, regardless of the truth." "It concerns me," Draven said quietly, and the directness of his words caught her entirely off guard. "It concerns me that a pack capable of recognizing your skill, your courage, your intelligence, still insists on measuring your worth by your age, rather than the substance of who you are. I have led armies, Elena. I have negotiated with kings far more dangerous than the threats we face here. I have never met anyone who commanded a room with the quiet authority you carry, and I do not intend to let idle gossip diminish that in your own eyes. Elena stood very still, unsure how to respond to words so unlike anything she had heard directed toward her in longer than she could remember. Warmth and something far more unsettling blooming together in her chest, until she hardly knew which feeling to trust. I do not know what to say to that. You do not need to say anything, Draven said, a faint, rare smile touching the corner of his mouth. I only wanted you to hear it plainly, from me, rather than left to wonder whether the respect I have shown you these past days was born only of necessity. He left shortly after, citing the need to continue overseeing the search for Edmund Cole, but long after the door closed behind him, Elena remained standing in the quiet of her cottage, her heart beating with a strange, unfamiliar lightness that made the exhaustion of the past days feel, for the first time, entirely worth enduring. That lightness did not last long. Night had fully fallen by the time Elena finished restocking her supplies, and she was preparing to finally rest, when a low, urgent knock sounded at her door, far more restrained than the frantic pounding of a genuine emergency. When she opened it, she found no one standing on her doorstep, only the empty darkness of the path leading toward the tree line beyond her cottage, the wind rustling through the leaves in a way that raised the hair along her arms. She should have closed the door immediately and barred it, and later she would tell herself that exhaustion had dulled her usual caution, but instead she stepped out onto the small porch, scanning the shadows for whoever had knocked, and then vanished. A twig snapped somewhere near the tree line, and Elena turned toward the sound just as a figure emerged from the darkness, moving quickly, deliberately, toward her. She recognized Edmund Cole an instant before he reached her, his face haggard and unshaven, nothing like the composed, sharp-featured advisor who had accused her so confidently 2 nights before. His eyes carried a wild, cornered look that made her instincts scream danger even before he spoke. You should not have involved yourself in matters that did not concern you, Edmund said, his voice low and shaking, with a mixture of desperation and barely restrained anger. My nephew was a foolish boy who could not keep his mouth shut, and now everything I have built is unraveling because of your interference. Elena took a slow step backward toward her door, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage, despite the fear pounding through her chest. Whatever you have built, Edmund, it was never worth the lives you were willing to risk to protect it. Nathaniel nearly killed an innocent man because you convinced him it was necessary. It was necessary, Edmund snapped, closing the distance between them with 2 quick strides. Everything I did was to protect this pack from a treaty that would strip families like mine of everything we have spent generations building. You cannot understand that, healer. You have never held land, never built wealth, never had anything of true value to lose. I have spent my life protecting people, Elena said, refusing to let the tremor in her chest reach her voice. That has always mattered more to me than land or wealth ever could. Edmund's expression twisted with something close to contempt, and for a terrible moment, Elena thought he might reach for her, might attempt some final, desperate act of violence, now that his schemes had collapsed around him. Her hand found the small blade she kept tucked into her satchel for cutting herbs, gripping it tightly, though she prayed she would not need to use it. Step away from her. Draven's voice cut through the darkness like a blade of its own, and Elena had never in her life felt such profound relief at the sound of anyone's arrival. He emerged from the shadows near the tree line, 2 guards flanking him, his expression carrying a cold, lethal fury that made even Edmund flinch backward. Your Majesty, Edmund began, his composure crumbling entirely now that he had been discovered. I can explain everything. I only wish to speak with the healer, to make her understand. You approached her alone, at night, after poisoning 2 innocent people and fleeing this estate, rather than answering for your actions, Draven said, his voice deceptively calm, in a way that Elena had already learned was far more dangerous than shouting. There is nothing you can say that will explain that away. Edmund's eyes darted between Draven and the guards flanking him, calculating some final, desperate escape, but before he could move, the guards had already closed the distance, seizing his arms and forcing him to his knees on the cold ground. He struggled briefly, cursing under his breath, before finally slumping in defeat, the fight draining out of him as swiftly as it had appeared. Draven crossed the remaining distance to Elena in a few quick strides, his hands settling gently on her shoulders as he studied her face with obvious concern. "Are you hurt?" "I am unharmed," Elena said, though her voice trembled slightly now that the danger had passed, the adrenaline that had kept her steady during the confrontation beginning to ebb away, leaving her shaking in its wake. "I should never have left you alone tonight," Draven said, his jaw tight with something that looked almost like guilt. "I had guards watching the estate grounds, but I did not think to post one near your cottage specifically. That was a grave oversight on my part." "You could not have known he would come here," Elena said, though she found herself grateful, more than she wished to admit, for the steadiness of his hands still resting on her shoulders, grounding her against the lingering tremor of fear. "I will not make that mistake again," Draven said quietly, and something in the fierce protectiveness of his tone settled over her like a promise she had not realized how badly she needed to hear. As the guards led Edmund Cole away in restraints, his desperate protests fading into the darkness, Draven remained beside Elena a moment longer, his hand lingering against her shoulder, before finally, reluctantly, falling away. "Come," he said gently. "I will see you safely settled for the night myself, and I will not be leaving a single guard's watch to chance again." Elena nodded, too exhausted and too shaken to argue, and as they walked together back toward the estate beneath the cold light of a rising moon, she found herself thinking that whatever the pack believed about her worth, whatever cruel whispers followed her through the corridors during daylight hours, none of it seemed to matter half as much as the quiet, unwavering protection of the man walking steadily beside her now. Word of Edmund Cole's capture spread through Ashwood before dawn, and by the time Elena woke from a few brief hours of restless sleep, the pack seemed to hum with a different kind of energy entirely, relief mixed with disbelief, that a man so trusted for so many years had been willing to poison innocent people to protect his own private wealth. Victor Hale summoned her early that morning, and when she arrived at his study, she found him seated behind his desk, looking older than she had ever seen him, the weight of Edmund's betrayal etched deeply into the lines of his face. "I owe you an apology," Victor said without preamble, rising from his chair as she entered. "I dismissed your presence in that council meeting 3 nights ago, suggested there were more suitable women for the king to speak with, and all the while, you were the only person clear-sighted enough to ask the questions that eventually exposed the truth." Elena inclined her head, uncertain how to respond to an apology she had never expected to receive. "You had no reason to trust my judgment over that of advisors who had served you for decades, Alpha Hale. I do not fault you for that." "Perhaps not," Victor said, "but I fault myself for allowing this pack's assumptions about your worth to shape my own judgment for so many years. You have served Ashwood faithfully since you were 17 years old, and I have offered you little more than passing gratitude in return." He paused, studying her, with an expression that seemed genuinely humbled. "The king wishes for you to join the formal negotiations beginning this afternoon, in an advisory capacity. I intend to support that request fully, whatever grumbling it may cause among the other council members." The formal negotiations were held in Ashwood's Grand Council chamber, a room Elena had entered only a handful of times in her life, always to tend some minor injury among the assembled elders, rather than to participate in the discussions themselves. Today, she took a seat near the long table at Draven's quiet insistence, aware of the startled glances from several advisors who had not expected to see the pack's healer seated among them for a matter of such importance. The negotiations began cautiously, both sides testing the boundaries of trust that had been shaken by the poisoning conspiracy, though Draven's delegation seemed satisfied that Ashwood's leadership had acted swiftly and decisively in exposing the traitor within their own ranks. The early discussions moved through familiar territory, boundary lines and hunting rights, trade tariffs and seasonal migration routes, and Elena listened carefully, saying little, waiting for the moment when her insight might genuinely prove useful, rather than simply symbolic. That moment arrived roughly 2 hours into the discussion, when one of Draven's senior advisors proposed a clause restricting Ashwood's access to a particular stretch of forest along the northern border, land that had long served as vital hunting ground during the harsh winter months, when game grew scarce elsewhere. Victor and his remaining advisors seemed inclined to accept the clause without much resistance, eager to avoid further conflict after the tumult of recent days. But Elena felt a familiar unease settle in her chest as she listened to the terms being discussed. She leaned toward Draven, keeping her voice low enough that only he could hear. That forest has fed this pack through 3 of the worst winters I have tended patients through. If Ashwood loses access to it, families in the outer villages will struggle to feed their children by midwinter, whatever grain reserves the treaty promises in exchange. Draven studied her for a moment, then raised his hand, halting the discussion mid-sentence. Before we proceed further with this clause, I would like to hear directly what consequences this restriction might carry for Ashwood's most vulnerable families. The room fell silent, several advisors exchanging uncertain glances, clearly unaccustomed to having negotiations paused for such a consideration. Victor cleared his throat. Your Majesty, the grain reserves offered in exchange should more than compensate for any loss of hunting access. Grain spoils in transport during heavy winter storms, Elena said quietly, and every head at the table turned toward her, some with open surprise that she had spoken at all in such a formal setting. I have treated families who nearly starved during winters, when promised supply routes were blocked by snow for weeks at a time. Fresh game from that forest has always served as insurance against exactly that kind of failure. Removing access to it without an equally reliable alternative would leave Ashwood's outer villages dangerously exposed. One of Draven's senior advisors, a stern-faced man named Oliver Grant, frowned deeply. With respect, Healer, matters of trade logistics extend well beyond concerns of individual families. This clause serves the broader strategic interests of both territories. With respect, Advisor Grant, Elena replied, keeping her voice calm, despite the challenge in his tone. Broader strategic interests mean very little to a mother whose children go hungry, because a treaty prioritized elegant trade routes over the practical realities of survival during a harsh winter. I have buried children who starved during lean seasons. I do not say that to be dramatic. I say it because it is the truth this table has not yet fully considered. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence, several of Ashwood's own advisors shifting uneasily in their seats, clearly uncertain whether to support her boldness or distance themselves from it. Draven, however, leaned back in his chair, studying the map spread across the table with renewed attention. Perhaps a compromise, he said finally. Ashwood retains seasonal access to the forest during the winter months specifically, while the northern territories gain priority access during the remainder of the year, when the land serves less critical purpose for Ashwood's survival. This would satisfy the strategic interests my advisors have raised while addressing the genuine concern Healer Marsh has brought to our attention. Oliver Grant's frown deepened, though after a moment of consideration he nodded slowly. That arrangement could work, Your Majesty, provided the seasonal boundaries are clearly defined to avoid future disputes. Victor Hale, who had been watching the exchange with an expression of mounting astonishment, finally spoke. I believe that compromise serves Ashwood's interests well, Your Majesty. Better, certainly, than the original terms would have. The negotiations continued for another hour, and though Elena spoke only a handful more times, each contribution seemed to carry more weight than the last. Advisors on both sides beginning to pause and consider her perspective before dismissing it outright, as though the events of recent days had finally forced them to reconsider assumptions they had carried for years without examination. When the session finally adjourned for the evening, several members of Ashwood's council approached her with quiet words of gratitude, a stark contrast to the dismissive treatment she had grown accustomed to receiving in rooms like this one. Draven found her afterward, in the quiet corridor outside the council chamber, his expression carrying a warmth he rarely allowed himself to show in front of others. You saved that forest today, and likely saved lives that would have been lost this coming winter, had that clause gone unchallenged. I only spoke the truth as I understood it, Elena said, though pride warmed her chest, despite her modest words. That is precisely what this pack has needed for a very long time, Draven said. Someone willing to speak difficult truths in rooms built on comfortable assumptions. He paused, studying her, with an expression that had grown steadily more difficult for her to read over the past days. Warmth mixed with something that looked almost like restraint, as though he were holding back words he had not yet decided he was ready to speak. I find myself relying on your counsel more, with each passing day, Elena, in ways I did not anticipate when I first arrived in this pack. Elena felt her pulse quicken at the quiet sincerity in his voice, uncertain how to respond to words that seemed to carry meaning far beyond simple political partnership. I am glad to be of service, Your Majesty. Draven, he said softly, when we are not standing before council chambers and advisors, I would prefer you call me Draven. The simple request settled over her with unexpected weight. an intimacy she had not anticipated, and was not entirely certain she was prepared to accept, though something in her chest warmed at the thought of it nonetheless. Draven, she repeated carefully, testing the shape of his name the way he had once tested hers, and found that it fit more naturally on her tongue than she expected. His answering smile, brief but genuine, lingered in her thoughts long after they parted ways that evening, a quiet promise of something neither of them had yet found the courage to name aloud, though it hovered now, unmistakably, in the space between them. Not everyone within the council chamber had watched the day's proceedings with approval. Among the visiting delegation stood a woman named Vivian Ashcroft, envoy from the Eastern Pax that Victor had mentioned days earlier as potential rivals threatened by Ashwood's growing alliance with the North. Vivian had said little during the formal negotiations, observing from her seat near the far end of the table with a composed, watchful expression that Elena had noticed more than once, drifting toward her with something colder than simple curiosity. That evening, as Elena made her way across the estate grounds toward her cottage, she found Vivian waiting near the garden path, apparently having sought her out deliberately rather than crossing paths by chance. The woman was elegant in a severe, controlled way, her dark hair pulled back tightly from a face that gave away very little of what lay beneath its composed surface. "Healer Marsh," Vivian said, inclining her head in a gesture that managed to convey politeness without any real warmth behind it. "I confess I did not expect to find the king's negotiations so thoroughly influenced by his pack's own healer. It is an unusual arrangement. I offer my honest perspective when it is asked of me," Elena replied carefully, sensing something calculated beneath the woman's pleasant tone. "Nothing more unusual than that." "Perhaps," Vivian said, studying her with an assessing gaze that made Elena distinctly uncomfortable, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. "Though I have traveled through many territories in my years serving as envoy, and I have rarely seen a king allow personal fondness to shape matters of state so visibly, it makes one wonder what other loyalties might be quietly shifting beneath the surface of this alliance. If you have concerns about the treaty's terms, Envoy Ashcroft, I would suggest raising them directly during the formal sessions, rather than implying something improper about honest counsel offered in good faith," Elena said, keeping her voice level despite the challenge she sensed lurking beneath the woman's carefully chosen words. Vivian's lips curved into a thin, unreadable smile. "Of course. I only wish to introduce myself properly, given how central your role appears to have become in matters that concern my own territory's interests as well." She paused, her gaze sweeping briefly over Elena in a manner that felt deliberately assessing, cataloging something Elena could not quite name. "It is remarkable, truly, how quickly circumstances can elevate someone from obscurity to influence. I do hope, for everyone's sake, that influence proves as trustworthy as it currently appears." Before Elena could respond, Vivian inclined her head once more and continued along the garden path, leaving behind an unsettled feeling that lingered long after the woman had disappeared from sight. There had been nothing overtly hostile in the exchange, nothing Elena could point to directly as a threat, and yet the careful, probing quality of Vivian's questions left her with the distinct impression that the Eastern envoy had been testing her, searching for some weakness or vulnerability that might later prove useful. Elena mentioned the encounter to Draven the following morning, finding him reviewing correspondence in the small study where they had first discussed the treaty's terms days before. His expression darkened slightly as she recounted the conversation, though he did not seem entirely surprised by it. "Vivian Ashcroft represents Pax that have grown increasingly resentful of Ashwood's rising influence under this alliance," Draven said. "I am not surprised she sought you out. If she believes you hold sway over my judgment, she may see you as a path toward undermining the treaty indirectly, either by discrediting you or by manufacturing some scandal that casts doubt on the integrity of these negotiations." "She said nothing I could report as a genuine threat," Elena admitted. "Only careful, pointed questions that felt designed to unsettle me." "That is often how such maneuvering begins," Draven said grimly. "Quiet observation, probing for weakness, before any direct confrontation occurs. I would ask that you remain cautious around her, Elena, and inform me immediately if she approaches you again." "I will," Elena promised, though the warning did little to ease the uneasy feeling that had settled over her since the previous evening, a quiet premonition that the peace following Edmund Cole's capture would not last as long as she hoped. Draven reached across the desk, his hand briefly covering hers in a gesture that felt both reassuring and startlingly intimate. Whatever comes, know that I will not allow anyone to diminish the value of what you have brought to this negotiation, or to this pack. You have earned every measure of respect you have received these past days, and I intend to see that respect protected, whatever challenges arise. Elena met his gaze, warmth spreading through her chest, despite the lingering unease Vivian's visit had stirred within her. Thank you, Draven. He smiled at the sound of his name spoken so easily now, and for a moment, sitting together in the quiet study with the weight of the previous day's danger finally beginning to ease, Elena allowed herself to believe that whatever challenges still lay ahead, she would not face them alone. The great hall was filled to capacity for the final formal session of negotiations, every seat along the long tables occupied by advisors, pack elders, and curious onlookers, eager to witness the conclusion of talks that had already survived betrayal, poisoning, and the exposure of a traitor within Ashwood's own council. Elena took her seat near Draven at the head table, aware once again of the whispers rippling through the gathered crowd, though the tenor of those whispers had shifted noticeably over the past several days. Where once she had been dismissed as an unlikely curiosity, an aging healer inexplicably favored by a visiting king, she now sensed something closer to grudging curiosity, even respect, among those who had witnessed her contributions to the negotiations firsthand. Not everyone had softened, however. Vivian Ashcroft sat near the far end of the table beside her fellow Eastern envoys, her expression composed and watchful as always, though Elena caught her gaze flickering toward her more than once during the early proceedings, calculating something Elena still could not quite name. The session began with a review of the terms already agreed upon, boundary adjustments and trade allowances carefully balanced between Ashwood's needs and the strategic interests of the Northern Territories. Elena listened attentively, occasionally offering brief clarifications when asked, though for the most part the morning proceeded smoothly, the difficult negotiations of previous days having already resolved most points of contention. The final matter on the agenda concerned a proposed expansion of trade routes through Ashwood's southern border, land that bordered territory claimed by the very eastern packs Vivian represented. As the discussion turned toward this final clause, Elena felt the atmosphere in the room shift subtly, tension coiling beneath the surface of otherwise measured conversation. This expansion would grant the Northern Territories passage through land, long considered neutral ground between our territories, Vivian said, rising from her seat with the deliberate calm of someone who had rehearsed her words carefully. My own pack leaders have expressed serious concern that such an arrangement threatens the delicate balance maintained among the Eastern Territories for generations. The route in question passes through unclaimed forest. Envoy Ashcroft, Draven replied evenly. No pack currently holds formal rights to that land. Formal rights? Perhaps not, Vivian conceded. But tradition and long-standing practice carry weight of their own, Your Majesty, as I am certain you understand. Her gaze shifted, deliberately, toward Elena. Though perhaps such nuances are better suited to those with formal experience in matters of diplomacy, rather than healers offering counsel outside their trained expertise. A ripple of murmurs spread through the hall, and Elena felt the weight of dozens of eyes turning toward her, some curious, some faintly hostile, waiting to see how she would respond to such a pointed challenge delivered in the most public setting possible. She kept her expression calm, refusing to let the barb unsettle her composure, though her pulse had quickened considerably. Draven, however, did not allow the moment to pass unanswered. He rose from his seat, his presence commanding the full attention of the hall in the way it always seemed to, effortless and absolute. Healer Marsh's counsel has proven more valuable to these negotiations than the collective wisdom of advisors who have spent decades at council tables, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. She identified the poisoning that nearly killed a member of my own delegation before any trained investigator had begun to suspect foul play. She uncovered the conspiracy that threatened to unravel this entire treaty before it was signed, and she has offered counsel on these negotiations, grounded not in abstract strategy, but in genuine understanding of what this pack's people actually need to survive and thrive. The hall had fallen utterly silent now, every eye fixed on the king as he continued, his voice unwavering. I would ask Envoy Ashcroft, what formal experience in diplomacy taught your delegation to recognize a poisoning conspiracy unfolding within your own ranks? Because Healer Marsh managed precisely that, within a single evening, using nothing but careful observation and genuine expertise earned through decades of service to this pack. Vivian's composure flickered, just slightly, though she recovered quickly. I intended no disrespect toward Healer Marsh's evident skill, Your Majesty. I only questioned whether matters of territorial diplomacy fall within that skill's proper scope. Then allow me to remove any doubt on that matter, Draven said. He turned toward Elena, and though the gesture was simple, a mere shift of his attention, the weight of it seemed to settle over the entire hall, like a physical presence. Elena, what is your assessment of this proposed route, given what you understand of Ashwood's southern villages and their relationship with the eastern territories? Elena rose slowly, aware of every gaze in the hall fixed upon her, and forced herself to breathe evenly before speaking, drawing on the same calm composure that had carried her through countless emergencies over the years. The southern villages have long relied on informal trade with the eastern territories for goods that Ashwood's own land does not readily provide, certain medicinal herbs among them that grow only in the eastern forests. If this new route disrupts that informal relationship without establishing a clear alternative arrangement, it risks harming the very villages closest to the border, regardless of which territory holds formal rights to the land. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. I would suggest the treaty include explicit protections for existing trade relationships between Ashwood's southern villages and the eastern territories, ensuring this expansion serves the northern territory's strategic interests, without severing ties that have sustained ordinary families for generations. That would address Envoy Ashcroft's stated concern about disrupting long-standing practice, while still allowing the negotiated route to proceed. A murmur of approval spread through several sections of the hall, and Elena noticed even a few of the eastern envoys nodding thoughtfully at the suggestion, clearly recognizing the practical wisdom of a compromise that addressed genuine concerns, rather than dismissing them outright. Vivian's expression remained carefully neutral, though something in the set of her jaw suggested she had not expected such a considered, reasonable response. That seems a fair compromise, Victor Hale said quickly, eager to see the negotiations concluded successfully, after the tumult of recent days. I would support including such protections within the final treaty language. Draven nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression, as he turned back toward the assembled delegates. Then let it be recorded that Healer Marsh's council has resolved the final point of contention in these negotiations. I trust that settles any remaining doubt about the scope of her expertise, Envoy Ashcroft. Vivian inclined her head stiffly, though her eyes carried an unmistakable coolness as they briefly met Elena's own. It appears her expertise extends further than I anticipated, Your Majesty. I withdraw my objection. As the session drew to its formal close, with advisors from both delegations beginning the careful work of finalizing the treaty's written language, Elena found herself surrounded by a small crowd of well-wishers, pack elders and advisors alike, offering words of genuine praise for her contribution to negotiations that would shape Ashwood's future for generations to come. It was a strange, almost disorienting experience, receiving such open acknowledgement after decades spent quietly serving in the margins of pack life, unnoticed and rarely thanked beyond the immediate gratitude of individual patients. Charlotte Ames and Margaret, who had mocked her so openly only days before, stood near the edge of the crowd, their expressions carefully neutral, though Elena caught the flicker of grudging reassessment in their eyes, as they watched advisors and elders alike seek her counsel with newfound respect. Draven found her once the crowd had finally thinned, his expression carrying a warmth he made no effort to hide now, even with dozens of onlookers still lingering within the hall. You handled that beautifully, he said quietly. Vivian Ashcroft is not accustomed to being outmaneuvered so gracefully. I only spoke honestly, Elena said, though pride and something warmer still glowed steadily beneath her composure. That honesty has changed how this entire pack sees you, Elena, Draven said. I suspect it may take Envoy Ashcroft rather longer to accept that particular truth, however. I do not believe she will let this matter rest quietly. Elena thought of the cold assessment in Vivian's eyes as she had withdrawn her objection, the careful, calculating quality that had not entirely disappeared despite her gracious surrender in front of the assembled hall. No, she agreed slowly. I do not believe she will either. But for the moment, standing in the great hall bathed in the golden light of late afternoon, surrounded by a pack that had finally, however belatedly, begun to see her clearly, Elena allowed herself to simply savor the quiet, unfamiliar warmth of being valued, exactly as she was. Victor Hale announced a celebration that evening, to mark the successful conclusion of negotiations, and by nightfall, the great hall had transformed entirely from the tense, formal setting of the afternoon into something warmer, filled with music and laughter, and long tables laden with food, prepared in honor of the treaty's completion. Elena arrived somewhat reluctantly, more accustomed to observing such celebrations from the quiet edges of the room than participating in them directly, though she found herself drawn steadily toward the center of the festivities regardless, greeted by pack members who wished to thank her personally for her role in exposing Edmund Cole's betrayal and shaping the treaty's final terms. She found a quiet moment near one of the tall windows overlooking the courtyard, grateful for a brief respite from the crowd, when Draven appeared beside her, 2 cups of warm spiced wine in hand. He offered one to her with a faint smile. "You have earned a proper celebration tonight, rather than simply standing at the edges of one," he said, handing her the cup. Elena accepted it gratefully, the warmth of the spiced wine, a welcome comfort after the intensity of the day. "I confess I am not entirely accustomed to being celebrated. I have spent so many years content simply to do my work quietly, without much notice." "That will need to change," Draven said, his gaze steady on hers in the flickering candlelight. "You deserve far more notice than this pack has given you, Elena. I intend to see that corrected, however I am able." She studied him for a long moment, the easy warmth of the celebration fading into something quieter, more intimate, as though the noise and laughter of the hall had receded into distant background. "You have already done more than I expected, Draven. More than I ever thought anyone would. I have only spoken the truth as I see it," he said, echoing her own words from days before, and something in the gentle familiarity of the exchange made her breath catch unexpectedly. "I have negotiated treaties with a dozen packs over the years. Elena, sat across tables from kings and alphas, far more experienced in diplomacy than you claim to be. None of them impressed me the way you have these past days. None of them made me reconsider what I believed I was searching for when I arrived in this pack." "And what were you searching for?" Elena asked softly, though some part of her already suspected the answer, hardly daring to hope it might be true. "A suitable match, by tradition's measure," Draven admitted. "A young bride from a prominent family, someone who would strengthen this alliance through the simple arithmetic of marriage and heirs. That is what I expected to find here, and what every advisor in my delegation still assumes I intend to pursue before we depart." Elena's chest tightened, old insecurities rising despite the warmth of the evening, the quiet intimacy of the conversation. "And now?" Draven set his cup down on the windowsill, turning to face her fully, his gray eyes carrying an intensity that made the rest of the crowded hall fall away entirely. "Now I find myself far more interested in a woman whose wisdom and courage I have come to rely upon more than I ever expected to rely on anyone. A woman this pack spent years dismissing, without ever once recognizing what she truly offered them." He paused, something vulnerable flickering briefly across his usually guarded expression. "I am not entirely certain what to do with that realization, Elena, given how quickly it arrived, and how thoroughly it has upended what I believed I came here to find." Elena's heart pounded steadily against her ribs, uncertain whether to trust the warmth spreading through her chest, the quiet hope she had spent so many years teaching herself not to feel. "I do not know what to say to that, Draven." "You do not need to say anything tonight," he said gently, echoing words she recognized from days before, though they carried a different weight now, heavier, with unspoken meaning. "I only wanted you to know it, plainly, before this celebration ends, and the ordinary business of politics resumes tomorrow." Across the crowded hall, half hidden by shadow near one of the far pillars, Vivian Ashcroft watched the quiet exchange between the king and the healer, with an expression that had grown considerably colder than the polite composure she had displayed throughout the day's negotiations. Whatever calculations had been forming behind her careful gaze since Elena's confrontation in the council chamber seemed to sharpen now into something more deliberate, more dangerous, though neither Elena nor Draven noticed her watching as the celebration continued around them, oblivious for the moment to anything beyond the fragile, unspoken promise beginning to take shape between them. The accusation arrived 3 days later, carried through the pack like wildfire through dry grass, and Elena first heard whispers of it while treating a young farmer's broken arm in her cottage, the words drifting through her open window from 2 women passing along the path outside. "They say she let a woman die years ago, deliberately, to cover her own mistake," one voice murmured. "Imagine, All this time we trusted her with our children's lives." Elena's hands went still over the farmer's splint, a cold, sick feeling spreading through her chest as she strained to hear more, though the women's voices faded quickly into the distance, leaving only the accusation hanging in the air like poison of its own. By the time she finished treating the farmer and made her way toward the estate's main hall, the rumor had already taken firm root throughout the pack, spreading with the particular speed reserved for scandal, involving someone whose sudden rise in standing had left many uneasy and eager for reason to doubt it. She found small clusters of pack members murmuring in doorways and courtyards, their conversations falling into uncomfortable silence whenever she passed, though this time the silence carried none of the grudging respect she had earned over recent days, only renewed suspicion, sharper now for having briefly been set aside. She found Draven in the council chamber, his expression grim as he reviewed a document laid across the table before him, Victor Hale standing beside him with an equally troubled expression. "You have heard the rumors," Draven said as she entered, not a question but a statement of fact. "I have heard fragments," Elena said, "enough to understand someone is accusing me of causing a woman's death." Draven gestured toward the document on the table. "This arrived this morning, delivered anonymously to several members of the council, myself included. It claims that 15 years ago, you allowed a woman named Catherine Vale to die during childbirth, rather than perform an emergency procedure that could have saved her, out of jealousy over her engagement to a man you supposedly wished to marry yourself." Elena felt the room tilt slightly beneath her, old grief rising sharp and sudden at the mention of a name she had not spoken aloud in years, a wound she had believed long since scarred over, rather than freshly reopened in front of the entire council. Catherine Vale died because her labor tore something inside her, that no healer of that era, myself included, had the skill or the tools to repair. I was 27 years old, still learning the deeper arts of my craft, and I did everything within my ability to save her. I grieved her death for years afterward, wondering if a more experienced healer might have known some technique I did not yet possess. "And the claim that you desired her fiancé?" Draven asked gently, though the question clearly pained him to voice. "Catherine's fiancé was my cousin," Elena said, her voice tightening with old, complicated grief. "I loved them both as family, nothing more. Whoever crafted this accusation either knows nothing of my history, or has deliberately twisted the truth to manufacture a motive where none existed." Victor Hale's expression had grown increasingly troubled throughout the exchange. "The pack does not know the full truth of what happened, Healer Marsh. Catherine Vale's death occurred quietly, without much public discussion at the time, given how young you were, and how devastating the loss proved for everyone involved. Most people currently spreading this rumor likely know only the barest fragments of what actually happened 15 years ago. Which makes the accusation all the more dangerous," Draven said grimly. "A fragment of truth, twisted just enough to suggest something far darker than what actually occurred. This was crafted deliberately, by someone who understood exactly how to wound you most effectively." Elena's thoughts immediately turned to Vivian Ashcroft, the cold calculation she had witnessed in the envoy's eyes during the celebration 3 nights before, the careful, probing questions she had asked upon their first meeting in the garden. "Vivian Ashcroft asked about my history when she first approached me. She seemed determined to find some vulnerability she could exploit." "It would not surprise me," Draven said, his jaw tightening with barely restrained anger. "Though proving her involvement without clear evidence will prove considerably more difficult than exposing Edmund Cole's conspiracy. This kind of poison spreads through whispers rather than wine cups, and whispers are far harder to trace back to their source." The following days proved among the most difficult Elena had endured in years, the accusation following her through every corridor and courtyard, some pack members openly avoiding her presence entirely, others watching her with a wary suspicion that stung more sharply than outright hostility ever could. Patients who had trusted her with their most intimate concerns for decades now hesitated before seeking her care, whispering among themselves about whether the pack's healer could truly be trusted with matters of life and death, given what the rumors suggested about her past. Elena bore the weight of it with the same quiet composure she had cultivated throughout her life, refusing to let the whispers show on her face, even as they carved fresh wounds into old grief she had thought long since healed. But alone in her cottage each evening, the accusations settled heavily over her, stirring doubts she had believed herself long past, whispered questions about whether she truly deserved the respect and warmth that had so recently, so unexpectedly, entered her life. It was Draven who refused to let the accusation stand unanswered. He called for a formal hearing before the full council, insisting that any claims serious enough to threaten the reputation of Ashwood's own healer deserved thorough, public examination, rather than being left to fester as unproven rumor. Elena felt a fresh wave of anxiety at the prospect of reliving Catherine's death before an audience of skeptical onlookers, but Draven's steady presence beside her throughout the preparations offered a measure of comfort she had not expected to need so desperately. "You do not have to face this alone," he told her the evening before the hearing, finding her in her cottage where she sat surrounded by old journals, searching through decades of careful records for any documentation that might support her account of what had truly happened 15 years before. "Whatever the council decides, I will not allow this false accusation to diminish everything you have built, everything you have given this pack over the course of your life. I appreciate your faith in me," Elena said quietly, exhaustion and old grief evident in her voice. "But I fear the damage may already be done, regardless of what the hearing determines. Trust, once broken, does not always mend so easily, however thoroughly the truth is eventually proven." Draven knelt beside her chair, his gray eyes searching hers, with an intensity that made her breath catch, despite the heaviness of the moment. "Then we will rebuild that trust together, however long it takes. I did not come to care for you because this pack approved of it, Elena, and I will not stop now simply because someone has tried to poison their opinion of you once again." He reached for her hand, holding it gently within his own. "You saved a stranger's life the very first night I met you, without hesitation, without thought for your own safety. I refuse to believe anyone could look at the whole of who you are and see anything but the extraordinary woman standing before me now." Elena felt tears gather unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, the weight of years spent carrying quiet grief and quieter dismissal finally beginning to loosen beneath the steady warmth of his conviction. "Thank you, Draven," she whispered, "for believing me, when it would have been so much easier not to." "I could never do otherwise," he said simply, and in the quiet of her small cottage, surrounded by old journals and older grief, Elena allowed herself to draw strength from the unwavering certainty in his voice, preparing herself for whatever the following day's hearing might bring. The council chamber was packed the following morning, word of the hearing having spread through Ashwood as quickly as the original accusation, curiosity, and lingering suspicion drawing pack members from every corner of the territory to witness whatever truth or scandal the day might reveal. Elena stood before the assembled council, with her old journals gathered carefully in her arms, her heart pounding, despite the outward calm she forced herself to maintain. Victor Hale opened the proceedings, his voice grave. "This council has gathered to examine a serious accusation against Healer Marsh, concerning the death of Catherine Vale 15 years ago. Given the gravity of this claim, and the anonymous manner in which it was delivered, we will hear testimony from all available witnesses before rendering any judgment." Elena spoke first, her voice steady despite the old grief threading through every word, describing the desperate hours she had spent trying to save Catherine, the internal tearing that no healer of that era possessed the skill to repair, the devastating grief that had followed her for years afterward. She produced her old journal from that period, the careful, detailed notes she had kept of every treatment attempted, every desperate measure taken, evidence of a healer who had fought fiercely for her patient's life, rather than one who had abandoned her out of jealousy or spite. An elderly woman near the back of the chamber rose slowly to her feet, requesting permission to speak. Elena recognized her after a moment as Margaret Vale, Catherine's own mother, a woman Elena had not seen in years, having quietly withdrawn from pack gatherings following her daughter's death. "I was present the night my daughter died," Margaret said, her voice trembling with old sorrow, but carrying clearly through the silent chamber. Elena Marsh worked for 11 hours without rest, trying every remedy she knew, calling for assistance from healers in neighboring packs when her own knowledge proved insufficient. "She wept beside my daughter's bed when there was nothing more to be done. Whoever has spread this cruel lie about jealousy and neglect either knew nothing of that night, or chose deliberately to dishonor my daughter's memory for their own purposes." A murmur swept through the chamber, the tide of suspicion visibly shifting as Margaret's testimony settled over the assembled crowd. Draven, seated at the head of the council table, allowed the moment to breathe before speaking. "I would like to know how this accusation came to be delivered anonymously to this council, rather than raised openly by whoever possessed such grave concerns, An anonymous accusation, designed to circulate as rumor, before any formal hearing could occur, suggests someone more interested in damaging a reputation than in uncovering genuine truth. One of Draven's own guards stepped forward, having been tasked with investigating the letter's origin over the preceding days. Your Majesty, we traced the parchment used for the anonymous letter to a merchant who supplies writing materials primarily to the visiting delegations housed within the estate's eastern wing. Further inquiry revealed that a servant assigned to Envoy Ashcroft's chambers was seen delivering several folded letters to different council members on the morning the rumor first began circulating. The chamber fell utterly silent, every eye turning toward Vivian Ashcroft, who sat rigid in her seat near the delegation's table, her composed expression finally cracking beneath the weight of open scrutiny. "This is absurd," she said sharply. "A servant delivering letters proves nothing. I had no knowledge of this accusation before it began circulating, the same as everyone else in this hall. Then you will not object to my guards questioning your servant directly, in front of this council, regarding who instructed her to deliver those letters," Draven said, his voice deceptively calm in the way Elena had learned to recognize as deeply dangerous. Vivian's composure faltered further, her eyes darting briefly toward the chamber doors as though calculating some means of escape, before she seemed to recognize the futility of resistance in a room full of witnesses. "I merely sought information," she said finally, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. Information that revealed a woman with a troubled history being elevated to influence far beyond what her station should allow. "I did not fabricate the death. I only shaped the truth to reflect poorly on someone whose sudden importance to these negotiations threatened my own territory's interests." "You twisted a grieving woman's tragedy into a weapon against an innocent healer," Draven said, fury barely restrained beneath his controlled tone, "in an attempt to discredit her because her honesty exposed weaknesses in your own delegation's position during these negotiations. That is not shaping truth, Envoy Ashcroft. That is deliberate cruelty, dressed carefully enough to nearly succeed." The council chamber erupted into murmured discussion, the tide of the room having turned so completely against Vivian that she made no further attempt at defense, sitting instead in rigid, furious silence, as Victor Hale formally declared the accusation against Elena baseless and malicious, striking it from any record, and issuing a formal apology on behalf of the council for the pain it had caused. Elena felt the weight of 15 years of quiet grief finally lift from her shoulders, as pack members who had avoided her only days before now approached with genuine apologies, ashamed of how quickly they had believed the worst, without pausing to seek the truth. Margaret Vale embraced her tightly before departing the chamber, whispering words of gratitude that settled deep into Elena's chest, healing a wound she had carried far longer than anyone in this pack had ever known. Draven found her once the chamber had finally emptied, his expression carrying a fierce protectiveness that had not entirely faded despite the hearing's resolution. "I am sorry you had to endure this," he said quietly. "No one should have to relive their deepest grief in front of an audience, simply to prove their own innocence." "You believed me before any evidence was presented," Elena said softly. "That mattered more than you may realize, Draven, after so many years of being doubted by people who should have known better." "I will always believe you," he said, his hand rising gently to brush a stray strand of hair from her face, the gesture carrying an intimacy that made her breath catch, despite the exhaustion of the day. "Whatever comes next, whatever this pack or any other tries to throw against you, I intend to stand beside you through all of it." Elena searched his eyes, finding nothing there but steady, unwavering sincerity, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, allowed herself to fully believe that perhaps, after decades of being overlooked, she had finally found someone who saw her clearly and intended never to look away. Vivian Ashcroft departed Ashwood within 2 days of the hearing, her delegation quietly recalled by her own pack leaders once word of her disgraceful scheme reached them, though the Eastern Territories portion of the treaty remained intact, negotiated separately with envoys of considerably more integrity, who arrived to finalize the remaining details without incident. With both the poisoning conspiracy and Vivian's cruel scheme finally resolved, a quiet peace settled over Ashwood in the days that followed, though Elena found herself unable to shake a persistent restlessness, aware that Draven's delegation would soon complete its business and prepare to return north, taking with them whatever fragile, unspoken connection had grown between herself and the king over these tumultuous weeks. She found him one evening in the same small study where they had first reviewed the treaty's terms together, bent over final paperwork by candlelight, and something in his expression when he looked up at her arrival told her he had been waiting, perhaps hoping, for exactly this moment. "The treaty is finalized," he said, gesturing toward the neat stack of signed documents on the desk before him. "My delegation departs in 3 days." Elena felt something heavy settle in her chest at the words, though she kept her voice carefully composed. The negotiations were a success then. Ashwood's future is secure. "It is," Draven agreed, though something in his tone suggested the treaty was not what weighed most heavily on his mind. He rose from behind the desk, crossing the small study to stand before her, close enough that she could see the careful deliberation in his gray eyes, as though he had spent considerable time preparing whatever words he intended to speak next. "Elena, I have spent a great deal of time these past weeks considering what I truly want, beyond the obligations of this treaty, and the expectations of tradition that brought me to this pack in the first place." Elena's pulse quickened, hope and old fear warring within her chest in equal measure. "And what have you concluded?" "That I do not wish to leave Ashwood without you," Draven said simply, the words carrying a weight and sincerity that made her breath catch entirely. "I came here prepared to select a bride from among the young women this pack considered most suitable, to build an alliance through marriage, as tradition demanded. Instead, I found someone whose wisdom, courage, and honesty have changed how I understand what true partnership actually means. I do not wish to build my future beside someone chosen merely for youth or status, Elena. I wish to build it beside you." Elena stood frozen for a moment, the weight of decades spent believing herself unworthy of exactly this kind of declaration, pressing against the overwhelming hope now blooming steadily within her chest. "Draven, I am 42 years old. I have spent my entire life as this pack's healer, unmarried, largely overlooked by the very people who now applaud my counsel, simply because circumstances forced them to notice it. I am not the queen this pack, or your own territory, expects you to bring home." "I do not care what either territory expects," Draven said, his voice firm with the same unwavering conviction she had come to rely upon so completely over these past weeks. "I care what I have witnessed with my own eyes since the night I arrived here. I watched you save a stranger's life without hesitation, while trained warriors froze in fear around you. I watched you expose a conspiracy that would have unraveled this entire treaty, using nothing but careful observation and genuine expertise. I watched you counsel this pack's leadership with more wisdom than advisors who had spent decades at that table, and I watched you endure a cruel false accusation with more grace and dignity than most people could summon, facing far smaller trials." He reached for her hands, holding them gently within his own. "Age has given you wisdom, this pack desperately needed, and never properly valued. I do not see a woman too old to matter, Elena. I see the only woman I have ever met who matters enough to change everything I believed I wanted." Tears gathered at the corners of Elena's eyes, decades of quiet dismissal, and old grief finally beginning to loosen their grip on her heart beneath the steady warmth of his words. "I have spent so many years believing this kind of happiness was simply not meant for someone like me," she whispered. "That my place in this pack would always be defined by usefulness rather than love." "Then let me be the one who proves that belief wrong," Draven said softly, his thumb brushing gently across her knuckles. "Marry me, Elena. Stand beside me not as a healer summoned in crisis, but as my equal, my partner, and my queen. I do not ask this because tradition demands it, or because this treaty requires it. I ask because I cannot imagine returning north without you beside me." Elena felt the last of her hesitation dissolve beneath the fierce sincerity in his gaze, decades of careful self-protection giving way at last to the simple, overwhelming truth of what she felt for this man, who had seen her so clearly from the very first night they met. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling with emotion she no longer wished to hide. "Yes, Draven, I will marry you." His answering smile was unlike anything she had seen from him before, unguarded and radiant, in a way that transformed his usually stern features entirely. And when he drew her gently into his arms, Elena allowed herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to simply feel wanted, treasured, and seen exactly as she was. News of their engagement spread through Ashwood swiftly, and while Elena had braced herself for renewed whispers and skepticism, she found instead that the pack's reaction carried a different quality entirely than the mockery she had endured weeks before. Having witnessed her courage, her wisdom, and her unwavering integrity firsthand throughout the crisis that had nearly unraveled the treaty, most of Ashwood now seemed to view the match not as some strange aberration, but as a fitting conclusion to everything they had watched unfold. Not everyone embraced the news without reservation. Charlotte Ames approached her cautiously the following morning, her earlier mockery replaced with something that resembled genuine, if reluctant, respect. "I owe you an apology, Healer Marsh. I judged you unfairly, assuming the king's attention was born only of circumstance rather than genuine regard. I see now how wrong I was." Elena accepted the apology graciously, recognizing in Charlotte's discomfort the same assumptions she herself had internalized for so many years, the belief that a woman's worth diminished with age rather than deepening through experience and wisdom. "We are all shaped by what this pack teaches us to value," Elena said gently. "I hope Ashwood learns, from all of this, to look more carefully at what truly makes someone worthy of respect." As preparations began for a wedding that would take place before Draven's delegation departed north, binding Ashwood and the Northern Territories together not only through treaty but through genuine partnership, Elena found herself walking through the pack's familiar streets with a lightness she had never experienced before, greeted now not with dismissive glances, but with warm smiles and genuine well-wishes from people who had known her for decades and were only now beginning to see her clearly. She thought often, in those final days before the wedding, of the frightened 42-year-old healer who had knelt beside a dying stranger, without hesitation, never imagining that single act of courage would unravel decades of quiet invisibility and lead her toward a future she had long since stopped allowing herself to hope for. 3 days before the ceremony, Elena made a quiet journey to visit Margaret Vale, carrying a small bundle of dried lavender, as she had done every season for years, though this time the visit carried a different weight entirely. Margaret welcomed her into her modest home with warm arms, settling her near the hearth with a cup of tea, before either woman spoke. "I heard the news of your engagement," Margaret said, studying Elena with an expression of genuine happiness. "Catherine would have been overjoyed for you. She always said you deserved more kindness than this pack ever thought to offer you." Elena felt her throat tighten with old, tender grief. "I have thought of her often these past weeks, wondering what she would make of everything that has happened. She would tell you not to waste another moment, doubting whether you deserve this happiness," Margaret said firmly, reaching across to squeeze Elena's hand. "You have carried grief and dismissal long enough, Elena. Let yourself be loved now, fully, without reservation." The words settled deeply into Elena's heart as she made her way back toward the estate that afternoon, a quiet, final release of guilt she had carried far longer than she realized, grief, finally transforming into something gentler, something closer to peace. That evening, Draven introduced her formally to 2 senior members of his own delegation who had remained largely quiet throughout the negotiations, an older woman, named Beatrice Thorne, who served as his most trusted counselor, and a younger man named Simon Fletcher, who had grown up alongside Draven since childhood, and served now as his closest confidant. Elena had noticed both of them observing her carefully throughout the weeks of negotiation, though neither had spoken directly to her until this moment. Beatrice studied Elena with sharp, assessing eyes, the kind of gaze Elena recognized immediately as belonging to someone who had spent decades protecting a king she clearly loved as family. "You understand what you are stepping into," Beatrice said, not unkindly, though the weight of the question was unmistakable. "Ruling beside Draven means far more than the quiet, private happiness you have shared these past weeks. It means bearing the scrutiny of an entire territory, advisors who will test your judgment at every turn, and challenges far greater than anything this small pack has thrown at you so far. I have spent my entire life earning respect from people, determined not to give it easily," Elena said steadily, meeting the older woman's gaze without flinching. "I do not imagine ruling beside Draven will prove any different in that regard, only larger in scale." Something shifted in Beatrice's expression, a flicker of genuine approval breaking through her careful reserve. "That is precisely the answer I hope to hear." She turned toward Draven with a faint, knowing smile. "I believe you have chosen well, Your Majesty, whatever tradition might have originally demanded." Simon, who had remained quiet throughout the exchange, finally spoke, his tone considerably warmer than Beatrice's careful assessment. I have known Draven since we were boys running wild through the northern forest together, and I have never once seen him speak of anyone the way he speaks of you, Healer Marsh. Whatever this pack failed to recognize in you all these years, I promise you the Northern Territories will not make the same mistake. Elena felt warmth spread through her chest at the genuine welcome in his words, a small but meaningful sign that whatever challenges awaited her as queen, she would not face them entirely without allies. Draven's hand found hers beneath the table, his fingers lacing through her own, with a quiet, steady reassurance that had become as familiar to her now as her own heartbeat. As the final days before the wedding unfolded in a steady rhythm of preparation, fittings for a gown far grander than anything Elena had worn in her life, careful discussions of ceremony and tradition blending both Ashwood's customs and those of the Northern Territories, Elena found herself returning again and again to a quiet sense of wonder at how thoroughly her life had transformed in the span of a few short weeks. The woman who had knelt beside a dying stranger, believing herself invisible to everyone beyond the narrow scope of her healing duties, now stood on the threshold of becoming queen of a territory that stretched far beyond anything she had imagined for herself. Whatever challenges still lay ahead as she prepared to step into this new life, Elena faced them now with a steady, unshakable confidence, no longer defined by what others believed she was too old to become, but by everything she had already proven herself capable of achieving, and everything she still intended to build, beside a man who had seen her clearly from the very first night they met. The morning of the wedding arrived crisp and clear, sunlight spilling golden across Ashwood's grounds as the entire pack gathered within the great hall, transformed overnight into something breathtaking. Garlands of autumn flowers woven through every pillar, long tables arranged for the celebration that would follow the ceremony itself. Elena stood in a small antechamber, studying her reflection in a tall mirror, hardly recognizing the woman looking back at her. Her gown was a deep, rich blue, simple in its elegance rather than ostentatious, chosen deliberately to reflect who she truly was, rather than some grander image of royalty she had never asked to embody. Her silver-streaked hair had been arranged simply, unadorned by the elaborate styles favored by younger brides, and she found she preferred it that way, a quiet, deliberate refusal to pretend she was anything other than exactly who she had always been. Grace, the kitchen worker who had helped her during the early days of the investigation, appeared in the doorway, her face bright with excitement. "The hall is ready, Healer Marsh. Everyone is waiting." "Thank you, Grace," Elena said, warmth spreading through her chest at the genuine joy evident in the younger woman's expression, a far cry from the cautious distance so many had once kept from her. As Elena made her way toward the great hall, she passed familiar faces lining the corridors, pack members she had healed and tended over the course of decades now smiling warmly, offering quiet words of congratulations as she passed. Even Charlotte Ames and Margaret, standing near the hall's entrance, offered genuine smiles rather than the careful, calculating expressions Elena had grown accustomed to receiving from them in years past. The great hall itself took her breath away as she entered, every seat filled with pack members and visiting delegates alike, sunlight streaming through the tall windows to illuminate the space in warm, golden light. At the head of the hall, standing before Victor Hale, who would preside over the ceremony, Draven waited, dressed in formal attire that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the quiet dignity he carried in every movement. His expression, usually so carefully guarded, softened entirely the moment his eyes found hers, something raw and unmistakably joyful breaking through his composed exterior. Elena walked a length of the hall alone, having decided weeks earlier that she wished to enter this new chapter of her life on her own terms, supported by the pack that had finally come to know her, rather than given away by any single person, as though she were property to be transferred. The walk felt longer than the physical distance suggested, decades of quiet dismissal and old grief settling into something lighter with every step, until finally she reached the front of the hall and took her place beside Draven, his hand finding hers immediately, steady and warm. Victor Hale began the ceremony with words that carried unexpected weight, acknowledging not only the union between Ashwood's healer and the Alpha King of the Northern Territories, but the broader lesson this pack had been forced to confront over the tumultuous weeks leading to this moment. We have learned, through circumstances none of us anticipated, that true worth cannot be measured by age or tradition, or the narrow expectations we so often place upon those we claim to value, Victor said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. Elena Marsh has served this pack faithfully for 25 years, healing our wounds, tending our sick, and asking little in return, beyond the simple dignity of being seen for who she truly is. It took a crisis, and the clear eyes of a king who refused to overlook her, for many of us to finally recognize what should have been obvious all along. Elena felt tears gather at the corners of her eyes as Victor continued, weaving together the customs of both territories into a ceremony that honored her history as healer, while welcoming her formally into her new role as queen. When the moment finally came for Draven to speak his vows, his voice carried the same steady, unwavering conviction she had come to rely upon so completely over these past weeks. "I did not come to this pack searching for you, Elena," he said, his gray eyes never leaving hers. "I came searching for an alliance, a suitable match, chosen by tradition, rather than genuine regard. Instead, I found someone whose courage, wisdom, and unwavering integrity changed everything I believed I understood about partnership and love. You have taught me that true strength is not measured by youth or status, but by the depth of character forged through decades of quiet, faithful service to others. I promise to stand beside you always, to value your counsel as fiercely as I value your heart, and to ensure that no one, ever again, mistakes your worth, simply because they failed to look closely enough." Elena spoke her own vows through unshed tears, promising to bring the same steady devotion to her new role as queen that she had brought to decades of healing work, promising to see clearly the people others might overlook, just as Draven had once seen her. When Victor finally pronounced them bound together as partners, the great hall erupted into cheers and applause, the sound washing over Elena with a warmth she had never imagined herself deserving of receiving so fully. The celebration that followed stretched long into the evening, music and laughter filling the great hall, as pack members from Ashwood mingled freely with the visiting delegation from the Northern Territories. The treaty that had brought them together, now sealed not merely through careful negotiation, but through a genuine bond of partnership that would shape both territories for generations to come. Elena found herself, at one point during the celebration, approached by the young man whose life she had saved on that first chaotic night weeks before, now fully recovered and beaming with genuine happiness. "I never properly thanked you, Healer Marsh, for saving my life that night. I understand now that everything that followed, the exposure of Edmund Cole's conspiracy, the treaty's successful conclusion, even this wedding, all of it began with your steady hands and quick thinking in that terrible moment." Elena smiled warmly, accepting his gratitude with the same quiet grace she brought to every act of healing. "You need not thank me. I only did what I have always done, what I will continue doing, throughout whatever new role I now carry. Caring for others has always been the truest measure of who I am, long before anyone thought to call me queen." As the evening wore on and the celebration finally began to quiet, Draven found her near the same tall windows where he had first offered her spiced wine days before, his arms settling naturally around her waist as they looked out over the moonlit courtyard together. "Regrets?" he asked softly. "None," Elena said, leaning into his warmth with a contentment she had never fully allowed herself to imagine before these past weeks, transformed everything she believed about her own worth. "Only gratitude, for a king who looked past what everyone else assumed about me, and saw exactly who I was." "I only saw the truth," Draven said quietly, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple. "The rest of this pack simply needed time, and the right circumstances, to finally see it too." In the months that followed, as Elena settled into her new life as Queen of the Northern Territories, while maintaining close ties to the pack that had shaped her for so many years, word spread throughout both territories, of the healer who had proven, once and for all, that true worth had nothing to do with age, and everything to do with the depth of wisdom, courage, and compassion carried within. Young women who had once dismissed her as unremarkable, now sought her counsel eagerly, understanding at last that the quiet, steady strength she carried was worth far more than the fleeting attention once lavished so carelessly upon youth alone. And Elena Marsh, who had spent 42 years believing herself too old to matter, discovered instead that she had simply been waiting, patiently and without complaint, for someone with the clear eyes to see exactly what she had always been worth. Before departing north with Draven's delegation, Elena made one final visit to the quiet chamber where Nathaniel Cole remained held, awaiting formal judgment for his role in the poisoning conspiracy that had nearly cost an innocent man his life. She found him thinner than she remembered, the weeks of confinement having stripped away much of the fear that had gripped him the night of his capture, leaving behind something quieter, more reflective. "I did not expect you to visit," Nathaniel said, rising from where he sat near the small window of his chamber. "I wanted to see how you were faring," Elena said honestly, settling into the single chair provided for visitors. "And I wanted you to know that I spoke with Alpha Hale on your behalf, regarding your sentencing. Your uncle bears far greater responsibility for what happened than you do, Nathaniel. You were a grieving young man manipulated by someone you trusted completely, and while that does not erase the harm caused by your actions, it does deserve to be weighed carefully against outright malice." Nathaniel's eyes filled with unexpected tears. "Why would you advocate for me, after everything I did?" "Because I believe people deserve the chance to prove they are more than their worst mistake," Elena said gently, "provided they are willing to do the difficult work of earning that second chance honestly." She rose to leave, pausing at the door. "Alpha Hale has agreed to a period of supervised service to the pack, rather than lengthy imprisonment, provided you demonstrate genuine remorse and dedication to making amends. I hope you will take that opportunity seriously." "I will," Nathaniel said, his voice thick with gratitude and renewed resolve. "I promise you, Healer Marsh, I will spend the rest of my life proving myself worthy of this mercy." Elena left the chamber with a quiet sense of peace, understanding that true justice required not only accountability for wrongdoing, but also room for growth and redemption, a lesson she carried with her as she stepped into her new role, guiding not merely a single pack, but an entire territory. The years that followed brought their own challenges, disputes between territories requiring careful diplomacy, harsh winters testing the resilience of the alliance Elena had helped forge, and the ordinary complexities of building a life alongside a man whose responsibilities stretched far beyond anything she had known as Ashwood's quiet healer. But through every challenge, Elena carried with her the same steady wisdom and compassion that had first caught Draven's attention on that chaotic night so long ago, and slowly, the Northern Territories came to know their queen not merely as a king's unexpected choice, but as a leader whose judgment and care shaped policy as thoroughly as any advisor who had spent decades at court. She established, within her first year as queen, a school for young healers throughout the Northern Territories, determined that no one with genuine skill and dedication should ever be dismissed or overlooked the way she herself had been for so many years. Young women, and increasingly young men as well, traveled from every corner of the territory to study under her guidance, learning not only the practical arts of healing wounds and treating illness, but the deeper lesson Elena had spent her own life discovering, only late in its unfolding, that true worth had nothing to do with age or status, and everything to do with the depth of one's dedication to caring for others. On quiet evenings, when the demands of court finally eased and she found herself alone with Draven in the private chambers they shared, Elena often thought back to that chaotic night in Ashwood's great hall, the desperate pulse fluttering beneath a stranger's throat, the weight of a king's unexpected attention settling over her like something she had not realized she was still capable of wanting. She thought of the whispered mockery that had once followed her through crowded halls, the quiet, persistent belief that her age had rendered her invisible to anyone who might have valued her beyond her usefulness. She thought, too, of how thoroughly that belief had been proven wrong, not through some sudden transformation of who she was, but through the simple, steady recognition of a man who had looked past everything the world told him to expect, and seen instead exactly what had always been there, waiting patiently to be noticed. Ashwood remained close to her heart throughout the years that followed, and Elena returned often, walking the familiar paths of the pack that had shaped her, visiting the cottage where she had once lived in quiet obscurity, now maintained as a small healing school for the pack's youngest apprentices. The young women who had once mocked her age now sent their own daughters to train under healers who had studied Elena's methods, a quiet, generational shift in how the pack understood worth and value, one that Elena had never set out to create, but which had unfolded naturally, from the simple act of refusing to disappear quietly, into the margins others had assigned her. Draven, watching her move through the world with the same steady grace that had first drawn his attention so many years before, often told her that she had changed more lives through her example than most rulers managed through decades of careful policy. Elena always smiled at such praise, though she never fully believed she deserved it, content instead simply to continue the quiet work of caring for others that had always defined her, now carried out on a far grander stage than she had ever imagined for herself. They thought she was too old to matter, once, in a hall filled with whispered mockery and careless dismissal. But the Alpha King had seen what everyone else had missed, and in seeing her clearly, had given Elena Marsh the chance to finally become everything she had always been capable of becoming. Not despite the years that had shaped her, but because of every hard-won lesson those years had taught her along the way.